Chapter 23. Gentlemen, I'm grateful for your time. Now, what have you got for me? Lieutenant General Sir James Outram fixed the two officers with a piercing stare. Major Ballard had brought Jack with him when he had been summoned by the Commander-in-Chief to deliver his latest assessment on the build-up of enemy forces that had been the talk of the army ever since the 2nd Division's arrival the day before. Ballard handed over a thick sheaf of paper, laying it almost reverentially on Outram's campaign table. "Sir, this is my latest report." Jack stood as straight as he could as he felt Outram's gaze wash over him. His body still hurt from the fight, and he did his best to hide the inevitable wince as he tightened his battered muscles. "Thank you, gentlemen. I'd be grateful for a brief summary whilst you are here." Outram sat back in his chair and lit a fresh cigar. The tent was fuggy, the air still ripe with the smell of the General's previous cigars, which he smoked at a prodigious rate. "Certainly, sir." Jack could see Ballard savouring the request. The commander of the intelligence department loved an audience, and he preened before beginning his briefing. "My sources indicate that the enemy is beginning to assemble at Borajoun, some 46 miles from here. Thus far he has gathered around 6,000 to 7,000 men, including at least 2,000 cavalry and around 18 guns. Outram sighed. "So, they have 2,000 sabres." He pondered the news. "That is many more than I have." He nodded for Ballard to continue. "The force is under the command of Shuja-ul-Mulk and includes at least 2 Karagozlu regiments of guards, 4 regiments of Sabris, and 1 of Shiraz. More men are expected to arrive in the coming weeks, and already the enemy is building up the quantity of supplies they will need for a campaign against us. This amounts to at least 40,000 to 50,000 pounds of powder, small arms ammunition, and what appears to be enough shot and shell to keep their guns supplied for a year of fighting. In short, sir, the enemy is massing his strength. When the whole is assembled, he will fall upon us with the intention of driving us into the sea." Outram said nothing as Ballard delivered the dour news. He sat back in his chair and puffed contentedly on his cigar. "So, the enemy is preparing to attack, but he is not yet ready to do so." He leant forward and propped his cigar on the already overflowing ashtray on his desk. "That is good news indeed." He fixed the 2 intelligence officers with a firm glare. "It is necessary to understand the nature of the enemy and then overawe him with bold initiative and resolute action. I am of a mind to attack immediately." He picked up his cigar again. Holding it in his teeth, he flipped open the wooden case on his desk. "Please, help yourselves." "Thank you, sir." Ballard bent forward and selected a fat cigar, rubbing it under his nose to savour the scent. "Captain?" Outram gestured towards the box, inviting Jack to take one. "No, thank you, sir. I do not smoke." Outram puffed out his cheeks, letting a cloud of blue-grey smoke escape in a rush. "You're probably wise." Ballard smiled at Jack's temperance. "It is the only vice he lacks, sir. We have to thank Captain Fenris for providing the intelligence that led to the discovery of the Persian spy." "The teacher?" Outram's eyes narrowed as he replied. "Yes, sir." Jack cleared his throat as his voice cracked. He could taste the cigar smoke, and he had to try hard not to cough as it filled his mouth. "That was good work." Outram looked hard into Jack's face, which still showed the effects of the fight with the Persian spy. His forehead sported a fresh blue and yellow bruise right in its very centre, and the cut to his face had barely had time to scab over. The knife wound would likely scar, but Jack knew the rest of the wounds would heal quickly. At least, he hoped they would. Ballard would likely have called it a small enough price to pay for ridding the army of an enemy spy, But to Jack's mind he had done more than his fair share. "So, have you put an end to the problem of the enemy knowing our every move?" Outram puffed on his cigar as he asked the question, his face half hidden by the cloud of smoke that he exhaled at regular intervals. "We believe so, sir." Ballard glanced once at Jack before continuing. "We are still investigating whether the man was working alone, but we are certain that he was working for the enemy. He relied on the local populace to take his messages to the enemy's camp. Unfortunately, there is nothing I can do to stop such a thing happening. There are simply too many locals with us." Jack had seen the hint of discomfort in his commander's face. The Persian spy had revealed little of any use, and Palmer had extracted nothing that added credence to Ballard's notion that there was a network of enemy spies in place. Everything pointed to the Munshi acting alone, but still Ballard remained to be convinced. "Very good." The Major had at least been able to reassure the army's commander that the problem was in hand. "It seems to me you have the matter under control. I would ask you to keep me informed of any developments." Outram nodded once before placing his cigar to one side. "So, we must take the initiative and strike before the enemy gathers his full strength. If he discovers that we're coming, he will either scurry away or meet us on a ground of his choosing. You may have dealt with this one spy, but the country is still against us, and there will be no shortage of people riding to warn the enemy the moment we march." Ballard nodded in agreement, listening intently to the general. Jack cleared his throat. He was as nervous as he had been when he had been the first out of the moat at Rashir. "Then don't let them know, sir." Outram looked at Jack sharply. "I think it is rather hard to disguise the movement of a few thousand infantrymen, Captain. Not to mention the enormous baggage train that follows. Even a blind man would know we were marching." Jack shook his head in denial. He saw Ballard's face go pale as his charlatan subordinate chose to give advice to a general. Jack forced down the nerves. It was the same as digging deep for the courage to lead men into battle. It had to be done, no matter how much you feared the first step. "Then don't march with a baggage train. The army has been conducting route marches for days now. General Stalker even had the whole division out last week. The locals must think we're either bonkers or too frightened to advance. It need not be any different when you march to attack." "What of supply?" Outram steepled his fingers. "We leave it behind." Jack was speaking with confidence now. He forgot Outram was a lieutenant general, and he nothing more than a deserter and a fraud. "The men march light, carrying just enough for a few days. The enemy are but 50 miles away. We can be there in 2 days. We strike hard and fast and catch them before they're ready." Ballard looked aghast, but the general seemed intrigued. He took up his cigar and drew on it, his eyes never once leaving Jack's face. "How long have you been in the Hussars, Captain Fenris?" Jack's heart thumped in his chest. "It's a recent transfer, sir. I was with the 24th. "So, the 24th's loss is Ballard's gain." Outram turned and looked at the intelligence officer. "You are lucky to have Captain Fenris on your staff, Major." Ballard recovered well. "I thank God for it daily, sir." Outram laughed. "As well you should." He looked back to Jack. "What happened to the spy?" Jack smiled, his fears receding. He liked Outram. "I believe he is still with the surgeons, sir." Outram seemed delighted by the response. "Major Ballard was correct. Smoking might be the sole vice you lack. Thank you for your briefing, gentlemen. It was very enlightening. You may go about your duties now." The two officers snapped to attention and saluted before beating a hasty retreat from the general's presence. Outside the tent, they both took a deep lungful of clean air. "Don't ever do that again, Jack." Ballard exhaled deeply as he spoke. "I think you forget who you really are." Jack laughed at the Major's expression. "I sup with the devil. Do not complain when his devilment rubs off on me." The use of his nickname made Ballard smile. They walked together in companionable silence through the encampment. As they approached their own tent, Palmer saw them coming and walked over to greet them. "This just arrived for you." He held out a letter addressed to Captain Fenris. Jack nodded his thanks before noticing the tears at the envelope's top. "You opened it." "Fucking boring it was." Palmer laughed at Jack's expression. "You really should get some more interesting friends." "And you should mind your fucking manners." Jack's anger rose quickly. "The next time I receive a letter, I suggest you leave it alone." Palmer shrugged, clearly unconcerned by Jack's belligerence. "Orders is orders, chum." Jack turned his anger on Ballard. "So you told your ape here to open my letters?" "I did." Ballard raised a single eyebrow at his subordinate's display. "Do not forget where I found you. I had to treat you with a certain degree of caution. Well, you know me better now." Ballard cocked his head as he considered the notion. "Yes, that is a fair comment." He looked at Palmer. "You can stop opening his mail." Palmer nodded, clearly not bothered either way. Jack scowled, despite having won the argument. He would have liked to have opened the letter for himself. Unlike the rest of the officers, he never got mail. Those with families received post by the bundle, thick wraps of letters and hefty packages and parcels arriving every few days thanks to the efforts of the Indian Navy. Jack received nothing, ever. He reached into the envelope, a strange excitement building, and flipped the letter over, scanning the contents to see if he recognized the signature. He did. It was from Commodore Featherston. He sat and read slowly, making sure he understood every word. It was a letter of congratulations. Featherston thanked him for finding the spy and for ending the problem that had dogged the army ever since it had arrived. The note was no more than a few scribbled lines, but Jack detected the sarcasm thinly veiled in the polite phrases. He had stolen Featherston's thunder. He had prevented the Navy from gaining credit for capturing the enemy spy, something the Commodore would surely have savoured. He folded the letter tightly before returning it to the envelope. He would show it to Ballard that evening, although Palmer was sure to have let the Major know its contents already. It would do Ballard good to know that they had put one over on the Naval Intelligence Commander. Jack felt pride at all he had achieved. He had been brought here to do a job, and now it was complete. He could sit back and watch the campaign unfurl, knowing he had saved many of the men under Outram's command from enduring extra suffering. It was almost a pity that the Persian spy was no longer able to communicate with his masters. In the message Jack had found in the fort at Rashir, he had been written off as little more than a hired thug. It would have been pleasing to know that the Persians would now know that the man they had written off so glibly was actually the one who had broken their power. Chapter 24. The army slipped away in the late afternoon. There was little grandeur to the departure, no martial spectacle to awe the inhabitants of Bashir. The baggage and supply carts stayed behind. The encampment was trusted to the care of Lieutenant Colonel Shepherd, whose men were reinforced by a party of seamen from the ships moored in the harbour. Outram was gambling on a quick march to take the Persian general by surprise, but he was cautious enough to ensure that he had a secure base to fall back to. The men marched with no more than 2 days' rations in their knapsacks. Bread and beef for the redcoats, chapatis for the native infantry. Their pouches and cartouches were full of ammunition, their rifles and muskets cleaned and ready for battle. Once again, they were left to find rest without their tents, the need for speed overriding any thought of comfort. Close to 4,000 men marched in 2 long lines of contiguous quarter columns. Most came from the force that had achieved victory at Rashier. The daily route marches had hardened them. The fight at the Dutch fort had proved that they could best the enemy. They advanced with confidence, eager to bring the enemy to battle, ready to prove that Great Britain's will could not be flouted. The force would march through the night. It would be a treacherous process. The land they would cross started out as little more than a swamp. The damp air was full of deadly exhalations, the men certain that the foul smell was sure to carry disease. The choice of route left the redcoats wondering at the sanity of their masters for subjecting the army to such a deadly miasma, yet it was the only way off the Bashir Peninsula. Once they had marched around the head of the Bashir Creek, they could strike inland, into the desert that separated the coastal lands from the dry, featureless interior. They would have to cover the ground quickly, and then summon the energy and willpower to fight. For the Persian army was gathering its strength. The Shah's orders were clear. His commander, Shuja-ul-Mulk, was to force the invaders back into the sea. The invasion must be stopped. Jack enjoyed the feeling of being back in the saddle. He had borrowed a roan mare from Outram's stables and had joined the procession of staff officers surrounding the commander-in-chief. It felt strange not to be marching with a battalion, though. He missed it. There was a security in being in the midst of hundreds of redcoats, a knowledge that whatever you faced it together. This time he rode towards battle accountable for no one other than himself. He would not be expected to show the courage that defined a true leader. In all likelihood, he would not even be called on to fight. Ballard had stressed the need to keep out of the battle, no matter what urge came upon him. He would not be allowed to transgress again. The ground underneath his horse's hooves gave out an obscene squelch as the weight of the horse and rider squashed the matted fibres of the earth together, forcing up small puddles of water that slowly disappeared back into the swampy soil. It would be hellish for the redcoats and the native infantry, who would be forced to march straight through the marshland. The sodden soil would all too soon turn into a quagmire, the rearmost battalions left to slog their way through a sea of mud. But Outram's orders had been clear. The enemy awaited, and so the army must march with haste, lest the chance to bring them to battle was lost. The wind howled across the barren plain. Bashir was far behind them, and the redcoats were battling their way inland. The marshland of the peninsula had given way to scrub, the featureless terrain affording the men nothing to look at other than the occasional scattering of date trees or an ancient fortified tower standing guard over the precious wells that gave life to the desolate land. Not that they could see much in the impenetrable gloom of the night. The wind-battered troops were covered in muck. The relentless wind kicked up huge clouds of dusty soil, which swirled and twisted across the arid plain. Still, they trudged onwards, gritting their teeth against the tempest, forcing their legs to move, each heavy tread taking them one pace closer to their objective. Jack was suffering. He had not been in the saddle for weeks, and it felt as if his backside had been rubbed raw by the constant contact. His tight-fitting hussar's uniform chafed, making every movement of the horse a misery. The wind drove the sandy soil into his face. The dusty, friable surface that had seemed such a boon after the morass of the swampland, transformed into a virulent enemy by the gale that had assaulted them for hours. When he could take no more, he left Ballard and the staff behind, and forced his tiring horse to catch up with the 64th, who marched at the front of one of the twin columns. He went to seek company, to find a friendly face to stave off the monotonous suffering of the advance. Lieutenant Knightley was with his company. The men had long been allowed to march easy. Few had the energy to chatter with their messmates, the long trudge wearing down their reserves of strength. "I say, you lucky blighter!" Knightley spotted Jack's arrival and lifted his face to peer up at his friend, who enjoyed the fortune of being mounted. "Have you come to gloat?" Jack ignored the barbed comment and slid from the saddle, wincing as the movement burned his tortured flesh. It was a relief to be on the ground, but his legs thought differently and nearly gave out underneath him as they were forced to take his weight for the first time in hours. "Steady there, sir." A strong arm reached out and set him on his feet. The sergeant gave him a friendly smile, accepting his thanks with the briefest nod of his head. Like all officers, Knightley was covered by an NCO, an experienced sergeant whose job it was to make certain that their officer survived in battle, giving the battalion's leaders the freedom to do their job without having to concentrate solely on their own safety. "It's a crappy night, Sergeant." Jack stretched out his spine, his hand kneading the small of his back that was cramped and aching from the hours in the saddle. "How are the men?" "Oh, don't worry about us, sir." The sergeant shot a gap-toothed grin back at Jack. "Scrap of wind ain't going to bother the likes of us. You should save your worry for the cavalry. Your lot don't take kindly to this sort of thing." Jack smiled at the comment. He still thought of himself as an ordinary foot soldier, no matter what type of uniform he happened to be wearing. "That's because the horses have more sense." The troops marching around them found the energy to laugh, or at least grin at the exchange. Jack relished the contact. He had not appreciated how much he would miss being with the men who made up the rank and file of the army. Jack reached into his saddlebag and fished out a bottle of brandy, which he handed to the sergeant. "Share this around, Sergeant." The man looked at Jack and grinned in appreciation. "That is rare kind of you, sir. Much obliged." He took a huge draught before handing the bottle and its precious contents to the man at his side. Then he turned and, without missing a step, called to the redcoat marching behind him. "Thatcher, take the gentleman's horse." Jack handed the reins of his borrowed mare to a boy who looked no more than 16 years old. The youngster smiled nervously and took a firm hold on the greasy leather. "Don't let her go, lad. You be paying her back for the rest of your service." The boy paled at the words. Jack laughed and clapped him on the back before turning and placing an arm on Knightley's shoulder and steering him a few paces away from the column. "You're good with the men?" Knightley looked pale. "They're good boys. You're lucky." "They terrify me." Knightley was too tired to hide his anxiety. "They only do what I say because Sergeant Rogerson tells them to." Jack smiled. He knew the feeling well. "You'll get the hang of it. Show them that you're willing to share every hardship and danger they face. Make sure they know what you expect them to do, and then show them how to do it. That's it. It's that simple. You should write a book." Jack would have laughed, but a spasm of pain seared down his spine, and for a heartbeat he thought his legs would give out. He kneaded the tense flesh in the pit of his back until the feeling passed, then stretched, arching his spine in a vague attempt to ease the discomfort. "I doubt I have the right credentials to write a book aimed at young gentlemen." "What's it like?" Knightley asked the question quietly. "What's what like?" "Battle. Real battle, I mean." Jack heard the fear in the young officer's voice. He sounded like an earnest schoolboy asking a friend what it felt like to kiss a girl. The two of them walked on together in silence, both hunched forwards as they battled through the sand that flayed into their faces. "Nothing will prepare you for when you first go under fire," Jack began hesitantly. He had never spoken so seriously of battle before, It was not the done thing, especially for an officer. All such talk was done in jest, the whole grisly affair discussed lightly as if it was nothing more than a game. He recognised Knightley's terror. There was little he could say that would assuage the young man's fear. Knightley would have to wrestle with that alone, but he wanted to help if he could. And so he forced open his soul, delving into the darkness that he usually kept locked away as he searched for the words to comfort his friend. At first, it's worse than you can ever imagine. He looked up and saw Knightley staring at him intently. But then the fear goes. There was doubt on the young man's face. Truly, it goes. You forget to be afraid and you do what you have to do. That's when you kill them. Jack heard the tremor in Knightley's voice. Yes, that's when you kill them. I'm not sure I can do that. You can and you will. Jack tried not to sound harsh, but he heard the steel in his reply. Because if you don't, they will kill you. I understand. You'd better. It's not as easy as you think. Jack sighed. Men die hard. They go down kicking and screaming, and they will still try to kill you, even if you have your sword buried in their damn guts. He looked across at Knightley and saw the younger man hanging on his every word. Don't hold anything back when you fight. Go at them with everything you have. Jack grimaced as he remembered the harder fights he had lived through. And don't forget to turn your bloody wrist. I won't forget. Knightley looked appalled at the idea. You'd better not. I've seen a dying man drive a bayonet straight back through the officer who had struck him just because the stupid fool forgot to turn his wrist. Jack glared at Knightley, reinforcing the message. Knightley looked at him, his eyes betraying the terror in his soul. I don't want to die. When I think of not existing... His voice trailed off. There's nothing you can do about that. Everybody dies. Knightley sniffed, barely in control of his emotions. It's easy for you. You've done it before. Jack laughed grimly. It was not a pleasant sound. Oh, it doesn't get easier. I sometimes feel I have a ration of courage. There are times when I think it's gone. Then, in battle, I feel this madness. Nothing matters then. I suppose I lose my mind. And that terrifies me even more the next time. Knightley watched Jack closely as he confessed his fear. He nodded slowly, as if coming to an understanding with his own emotions. I don't know how you go back. To battle, I mean. Jack shivered, despite the warmth of the night. At first, you think you're immune, that nothing can happen to you. It'll always be some other fellow who'll die. Then you see so many men get hit that you realise it could happen to you. So maybe the only way to survive is to be more careful. But then when the lead is flying and the enemy come at you, you find that you fight just as hard anyway. No matter how much you've told yourself to take it easy and let someone else do the crazy stuff. That's when you realise that one day it is going to happen to you, no matter what you do, and that's when it gets tough. When you know it's just a matter of time. He looked at Knightley, trying to see the effect of his words. Then you can either carry on or give up. And some of us don't have the option of giving up. Knightley didn't speak. He seemed lost in another world. It was several minutes before he looked at Jack and forced out a tired smile. What a life. Jack smiled in return. You chose to be an officer. The men have called you sir and done what you tell them. Now it's your turn to pay for that respect. You have to do your best because that's what they deserve. That, my friend, is the key. Your responsibility to the men comes first, even before your own life. He reached out and placed his hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Don't worry. You'll be fine." They marched on in silence, every step taking them closer to the place they both feared most of all: battle. Chapter 25. The sand got everywhere. It chafed against the redcoats' skin. The seams of their trousers turned into abrasive weapons of torture that scoured the delicate flesh from their bodies and made every step an unrelenting agony. It filled their eyes, leaving them red raw and sore, the men blinking and squinting in the fierce early morning light. The sand had become the enemy, its painful presence adding to the misery of the long advance. The columns marched on, the officers relentless as they drove their commands forward, ignoring the complaints and the men who slid silently from the ranks, their bodies dragged out of the line of march lest they be crushed under the merciless boots of their comrades. These unfortunate souls were abandoned to the musicians from the battalion's bands, who had stowed their instruments so they could take up their secondary role as stretcher-bearers. The fallen were taken to the surgeons and the pitifully small collection of bullock-pulled wagons, their passing unremarked amongst their fellows, who could do nothing but march onwards, forcing out step after step, the need to cover the distance overriding the need for compassion. The long columns had walked through the night, carrying on until the sun touched the horizon, the men waiting stoically for the order to halt. Still they marched on, advancing into the morning sunlight, forcing their aching bodies onwards, the miles crawling past. It was 9 o'clock before the command to halt was passed along the line. The exhausted men had no energy for the horseplay that would usually follow a march, or the banter that would see them find something to laugh about, no matter how dreary their temporary home. The exhausted redcoats slumped to the ground, even the rock-hard soil a welcome respite after the hours they had spent, heads down, grinding through the miles. They would spend the day where they were, the men left to pile their weapons and seek what respite they could whilst still remaining in the order of march. They had covered nearly 26 miles, but they were barely over halfway. The men lay down and rested, baked by the sun, waiting for evening, waiting for the command to march once more. Late in the afternoon, the battalions formed up. The twin columns snaked back across the barren plain like two lines of red ants, the sense of the individual lost in the vastness of the whole. The drummer boys picked up their sticks before rattling them against the taut skins of their instruments, beginning the mesmerizing rhythm of the march that would continue until the men were finally allowed to march easy. The two columns lumbered into life. Like a pair of enormous beasts, they lurched forward, the braying voices of the sergeants rippling along the ranks as they forced their men to order. As if at a secret signal, the weather changed. What had been a clear blue sky darkened as the redcoats slipped into the rhythm of the march. Huge banks of dark grey-blue clouds rolled in from the horizon, smothering the last of the sun's rays and casting an ominous shadow over the advancing troops. The men marched in silence, heads down, trudging through the miles. In the gloom there was little to see, the few trees and olive groves soon lost in the darkness. The men could only make out their fellows, their world reduced to nothing more than the back of the man in front and the heavy sand beneath their feet. The only sound, the thump of their boots hitting the hard-baked soil, the jangle of their equipment and the occasional rasp as men forced air into their tired, aching lungs. The last of the light was soon gone, and the redcoats advanced into the night. They marched on, each man surrounded by hundreds of fellow soldiers, yet still alone. A single voice began to sing. It came from the ranks of the 64th, the lead battalion in the left-hand column, and cut through the silence that had settled heavily over the redcoats like a single ray of sunshine piercing a storm cloud. And to my heart in anguish pressed the girl I left behind me. The men recognized the words. The voice sang them well, the purity of the sound only wavering as its owner drew breath. The notes of the familiar tune flowed over the marching troops, a balm that soothed away the misery of the relentless advance. I shared the glory of that fight, sweet girl I left behind me. A deeper voice picked up the melody. The two voices sang together, the words blending, the tones merging into one. More men joined in, the song spreading quickly through the tight-packed ranks. They sang softly, using the music to lift their flagging spirits. Dishonour's breath shall never stain the name I leave behind me. Lieutenant Knightley closed his mouth and listened to what he had started, the men picking up the tune and taking it for their own. The redcoats sang well. They kept their voices low, but the song settled over the noise of the march so that the tramp of heavy boots was lost in the beautiful lament. When it ended, the men fell silent once more, sharing the moment, each thinking his own thoughts, savouring his own memories. The feeling of camaraderie was complete, and Knightley was not sure he'd ever experienced an emotion as pure or as heartfelt. Then a loud voice in the centre of the column lifted to bellow the first lines of "Cheer, boys, cheer," and the spell was broken. The men hooted aloud before joining in with gusto, the deep, sombre melody replaced by the raucous joy of bellowing out the cheerful song. Knightley smiled at his men's spirit. His redcoats could take anything. He knew that he would never fully understand their indomitable spirit. They came from the meanest of backgrounds. They were the dregs of society, the flotsam and jetsam, the scum from the jails and the boys from the workhouse. Yet they were willing to fight and die for their country. As they cheered their own singing prowess, their faces betraying the simple delight of being with their mates, he remembered what Fenris had told him about the responsibility of leading the men, of putting them first, even over his own life. To fail them was becoming unthinkable, no matter what the cost. It was long after night had fallen that the redcoats were ordered to halt. Once more they would seek their rest in the order of march, so that they were ready to advance with the first light of the new day. They were not to be left to rest in peace. Thunder rolled across the sky, the deep, resonating crashes echoing through the empty landscape, the ominous booms rousing even the most exhausted men from his rest. Lightning followed, slashing through the darkness, the brilliant flashes searing the sky into temporary daylight before plunging it back into an all-enveloping blackness. It was a display of raw power, the forces of nature providing a spectacle of natural violence. Then came the rain. It fell in solid sheets, a deluge that soaked the redcoats to the skin. Without shelter, the men could do nothing but endure the tempest as best they could, each man's misery self-contained, bodies wrapped in their greatcoats, faces hidden under their shakos. They sat in silent misery and waited for dawn, looking to the sky and wondering at the power of the gods, asking themselves if the angry display was a prophecy, a dire warning of what was to come. Chapter 26. The sound of rifles firing awoke Jack with an uneasy start. He scrabbled to his feet, his boots slipping on the damp earth so that his heels gouged thick crevices into the topsoil, a sudden, nervous energy searing through his veins. He looked around, his eyes running over the rest of the staff officers, who had made their beds wherever they could, those still at rest looking like so many corpses, their bodies hidden away under their blankets. He searched for the danger, for the enemy that had appeared to make the sentries open fire. He saw nothing but the miserable faces of exhausted and sodden redcoats, the grimaces and scowls as the bedraggled soldiers in the nearest battalion pulled themselves to their feet and began to prepare for the march. He suddenly understood the rifle fire and sat back heavily on the ground before running his hands over his face, rubbing vigorously in a vain attempt to bring himself to life. Within moments, the bugle sounded reveille, the loud call echoing around the barren ground where the battalions had spent the night. "What's that all about?" Ballard had not moved. He sat next to Jack, hunched deep into his greatcoat, a horse blanket draped over his shoulders. It was difficult to discern the man huddled underneath. "The sentries are discharging their wet cartridges." Jack sighed and forced his aching joints into action, this time taking more care as he began to move. His back ached, the base of his spine on fire as if red-hot pokers jabbed into the very fibre of his being. Ballard grunted in reply. "Come on." Jack turned and offered his commander a hand. "Time to get up." He hauled the major to his feet, and the two officers stood in silence as they contemplated the dreary scene around them. The few hours' rest had done little to revitalize them. The long night hours spent enduring the misery of the thunderstorm that had raged without pause until shortly before dawn. Jack busied himself doing his best to brush off the worst of the mucky crust that was caked onto the seat of his overalls. He knew the army faced another long march, the enemy still miles away inland. He remembered his enthusiasm when he had told Outram that the men could advance with ease. Back then, the 50 or so miles had seemed an easy obstacle to overcome. Now, with his body aching and his sodden uniform stuck to his skin, it was hard to see how they could make it to their destination intact, let alone fight a battle when they got there. If Ballard's intelligence had been correct, the enemy was no more than 8 miles distant. Outram had gambled everything on a quick dash across country. If the enemy had been forewarned, they would be ready for the British advance. The redcoats would either be forced to fight on ground of the Persian general's choosing, or they would see nothing more than the rearguard of an enemy long gone in flight. If the Persians chose to pick a fight, it would be a close-run affair. After the long march, the redcoats were in poor condition. Tired, battered, and outnumbered, they would be forced to assault prepared positions on terrain that would inevitably favour the defender. It would be a hard fight, with defeat as likely an outcome as victory. But if the gamble had worked, the enemy army would be caught in disarray. The British expeditionary force would be able to sweep forward and force the Persians either to fight unprepared or to flee in chaos and disorder. If they could catch the enemy and bring him to battle quickly and without forewarning, victory was almost assured. "There they go!" Ballard twisted in the saddle so he could watch the British cavalry rushing forward. The 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry passed to the left of the column, moving from their position covering the flanks to the front of the now stationary column. The enemy had been sighted. The men had marched with the sunrise. The anticipation of battle had quickened the pace, the troops eager to end the long, wearisome trudge across barren country. Rumours had spread swiftly. Every redcoat now knew that the Persian encampment was only a few miles ahead, yet no one, not even the commander-in-chief, knew whether the enemy was waiting, ready for their arrival, or whether they had been thrown into chaos by the sudden appearance of the invading army. Staff officers put their spurs to the sides of their horses, a sudden bustle replacing the calm of the morning march. Orders needed to be delivered to the brigade and battalion commanders to move the battalions out of the marching column and into the long lines in which they would engage the enemy. The junior officers whose role it was to deliver these messages burst away from the huddle of senior officers. each one puffed up with self-importance as they went on their vital errands. "May I go with them?" Jack chafed at his impotence. He had fidgeted in the saddle as the blue-coated cavalry had ridden past, the sudden flurry of activity infectious. "No, you may not." Ballard let out a disapproving humph at his subordinate's suggestion. "Must I remind you of your proper station again?" Jack sighed and settled into the saddle, letting his horse's reins go limp. "No." "You sound like a petulant child." Ballard smiled at Jack's pathetic expression. "You will soon have things to do. We will be called on again." Jack sat straighter in the saddle as he peered ahead. He could not make out the enemy. All he could see was the cloud of dust kicked up by the fast-moving horses of the light cavalry rushing forward to drive off the enemy vedettes. This is a gloomy place for a battle. Ballard chewed his lip and looked at the terrain to the sides of the column. The high hills were certainly forbidding. They had funneled the advance, forcing the column to march directly for the enemy's encampment at Bourajun. There was no room for deft manoeuvre, for the subtlety of a flanking march. A handful of men could hold off an army in the hills. The narrow gullies and ravines a nightmare for an attacking force. Outram had had to order the advance on the flatter ground between the hills. It was his only choice, but it meant that the army would have few options when they came across the enemy. If the Persians knew they were coming, the fight would be brutal in its simplicity. Maybe the enemy chose it that way. Jack enjoyed the grim comment. It was his way of paying Ballard back for his refusal to let him join the cavalry. Perhaps. Ballard lifted his hussar's busby with its glorious 8-inch scarlet osprey feather plume before settling it back in a more comfortable fashion on his head. Perhaps they are not ready for us. They'd better not be. Outram would have my guts for garters. I think you take too much on yourself. Ballard smiled, enjoying his own turn to send a barb towards his fellow intelligence officer. I rather fancy the general had his own ideas. I doubt you swayed his mind. Jack scowled. Perhaps. Ballard laughed and then fell silent, cocking an ear as he listened intently. The sound of rifle fire rippled down the column, echoing around the empty hillsides. The huge voices of the regimental sergeant majors followed the gunfire, and the column shook itself into life. With all the precision and martial splendour of the parade ground, the battalions manoeuvred into line. The left-hand column would form the second rank, the right-hand column the first. With the drummers marking out the time, the hundreds of red-coated soldiers swung into the formation they would use to attack. Each battalion formed into a line 2 men deep. With 4 battalions in the first line and 3 more in the second, the army snaked across the plain, the exposed flanks protected by the limited number of cavalry at Outram's disposal. The battalion skirmishers broke from the formed ranks and took their place to the front of the tightly packed line, ready to screen it from any enemy skirmishers. The tactics Outram employed had changed little since the days of Wellington and the battles fought in Portugal, Spain and France. Manufacturing had improved the weaponry, the Enfield rifles carried by the regular British Army regiments more powerful than any weapon previously brought to the field of battle. Yet their leaders clung to the anachronistic principles of a dead general and the battles he had fought over 40 years earlier. The British line bustled with purpose. This was what they had come all this way to do. The redcoats looked at one another as they heard the sounds of fighting ahead. The men of the light cavalry and the rifle battalion that formed the vanguard of the army already engaging the enemy's troops. Soldiers fiddled with their equipment, making sure everything was just so, their fears building as the order to advance rippled down the line. Each man's belly squirmed with terror, the clammy hand of death suddenly present at every shoulder. Faces flushed with the exertion of the march paled as they contemplated what was to come, the thought that these might be their last minutes on earth sending icy flushes through their veins. The battalion colours were unfurled. The gaudy silk caught the morning light, the bright reds, blues and golds adding grandeur to the display. To the beat of the drums, the lines marched forward. The sight was like a grand painting, the long, steady rows of grim-faced soldiers marching into battle with stoic grace. The rifle fire died out. The men sucked in their breath and stiffened their sinews as they braced themselves for battle. A flurry of staff officers galloped past the marching redcoats, the sudden activity sending a spurt of excitement flashing through the tight ranks. Sergeants and corporals bellowed at their charges as heads turned to watch the fast-moving gallopers. Yet the whispers flowing through the battalions were impossible to stop. "What the devil is going on?" Ballard twisted and turned in the saddle as he tried to watch all of the sudden comings and goings around him. A cornet from the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry galloped into the gaggle of officers clustered around Outram. His light blue tunic was covered in a fine layer of dust, and streaks of sweat had carved thin channels in the layer of grime coating his face. The young officer handed a scrap of paper to the general, his horse skittish as it was forced to an abrupt halt. Jack leant forward in the saddle as he tried to listen to what was being said. He and Ballard sat close to Outram's staff, on the periphery of the officers charged with running the day's affairs. Without any direct involvement, they had no more idea what was going on than the humblest redcoat marching in the centre of his battalion. "I cannot hear." Jack's face twisted in vexation. The cornet was on the move once more. He'd snatched an order from the hand of Captain Hunter before forcing his mount into a tight turn and beginning the long, fast ride back to the vanguard. Another half-dozen staff officers left in the moments that followed, each bearing a fresh message for the brigade commanders. "Something's up." Jack slapped his thigh in frustration. "Your powers of deduction are a wonder, Jack." Ballard scowled as his irritation threatened to boil over. He hated not knowing what was happening. Jack had opened his mouth to reply when a new series of orders were bellowed out in the nearest battalion. They were orders to halt. The attack was being reined in. The redcoats' fears had been unfounded. There would be no fighting, no great battle to mark the start of the campaign. The enemy had fled. Chapter 27. The enemy encampment was enormous. It covered the ground outside the town of Borajun, its half-dozen acres liberally smothered with abandoned supplies. The engineer officers who had travelled with the column made a quick tally and estimated there was nigh on 40,000 tons of black powder. There was food enough to feed a dozen armies the size of the expeditionary force, with sacks of flour, rice and grain stacked in vast heaps like some bizarre offerings to a pagan god. "Damnation!" Ballard kicked an abandoned stand of muskets, stepping back quickly as they tumbled to the ground, the sudden clatter causing a dozen faces to turn in their direction. Jack looked around at the encampment. The mud wall that surrounded it was not much more than 2 feet high. It was barely substantial enough to slow a man on foot, let alone deter a force of charging cavalry. It was a place of shoddy workmanship, constructed with little thought and even less care. Now that it was abandoned, it looked pitiful. It makes no sense. Jack glanced at his commander, his bewilderment clear. Why not use that damn town? He pointed towards Borajun. With little or no effort, it could have been turned into a stronghold for the Shah's army. Even the most basic preparations would have made it a horrendous place to attack. Regularly spaced tower bastions protected the high walls, with a wide ditch that was at least 15 feet deep surrounding the whole village. Beyond this were wide fences made from thorns and cactus bushes, obstacles that would have slowed any attacker. The town could have been readily converted into a nearly impenetrable fortress, Yet it had been ignored. Ballard sighed. Perhaps they never expected us to attack them. Then they're fools, Jack scowled. Perhaps. But they knew we were coming. That means they are not totally without merit. Ballard's voice was bitter. That's madness. No one knew we were coming. And they left all this shit. Jack waved his arm to encompass the supplies scattered across the encampment. Why not take it with them if they were warned? They cannot have known. He poured scorn on his commander's opinion. He did not want to think what it meant if the enemy had been warned. He had captured the spy himself and paid a bloody price for doing so. He did not want to believe that his efforts had been for naught. Of course they bloody knew. Ballard was struggling to contain his anger. If we had caught them by surprise, they would still be here. They would have been forced to fight, or else they would now be running like a bunch of frightened schoolchildren. How can you be so sure that's not what's happened? Certainly looks to me like they left in a damn hurry. Because it's so bloody obvious, a child could see it. Perhaps you'd care to enlighten me, since I'm too bottle-headed stupid to see it for myself. Ballard placed his hand to his forehead. Where are their guns, Jack? Where is their bloody artillery? He swept his hand around the encampment. At regular intervals along the low wall were prepared artillery positions. The Persians might not have chosen the wisest place for their camp, but they had taken the time to sight their guns with care, building a number of protective enclosures for their precious cannon. It would have taken time and effort to extricate the heavy guns, something they could only have done if they had been given warning of the British approach. There is no way they could have dragged all the guns away in time. Ballard looked distraught. It would have taken them hours. This, he kicked at a sack of powder to emphasize his point, is almost worthless. They have food and powder to spare. They can rebuild another supply dump like this in a few days. They must have been warned. Jack finally understood. The British advance had been swift. Even a rider on a fast horse would have struggled to keep pace with the column, let alone beat it to the enemy camp. By rights, they should have caught the Shah's army with its drawers round its ankles. Instead, they had seen nothing but the enemy's rearguard. They had captured the camp, and with it supplies that the Shah's army would need to begin its campaign to drive the invaders back into the sea. But the enemy had been given enough warning to escape to the hills. Ballard was correct. Rice, grain, and even powder could be replaced. Artillery could not. Shuja-ul-Mulk had been given a vital warning. He had pulled his army back to the formidable heights where it was impossible for the British force to attack him. Jack had thought that the capture of the Persian Munshi had ended that particular threat to the success of the campaign. He had been wrong, and now Ballard's suspicions were proved to be correct. The enemy had more than one spy at the heart of the British Expeditionary Force. This is an intolerable situation, gentlemen. Completely and utterly intolerable. Major General Stalker delivered the damning indictment. He had summoned the two officers from the intelligence department to attend on him the moment his command tent had been erected, and had launched straight into a tirade as soon as they had taken their seats. Sir, we are doing all we can. Ballard scowled as he defended his department. We believed that by finding the spy we had put a dent in the enemy's supply of information, either ending it completely or at least damaging their efforts sufficiently to give us time to work on discovering the rest of the network. Well, you clearly failed. That much is damn clear. Jack watched Stalker's face turn purple as he berated the two officers. He felt the shame of the failure keenly. He had been so proud of his efforts, happily accepting the plaudits for having denied the enemy their spy. To have been so mistaken hurt his pride. Enduring Stalker's invective was humiliating enough, yet their disgrace was not to be delivered behind closed doors. The General had invited an audience. "Featherstone, you are uncommonly quiet." Stalker turned his attention to the naval commodore. "General Outram asked your department to join this campaign so that you can share what information you have at your disposal and assist with the analysis of the facts gathered by our patrols. Thus far you seem to have added precious little. May I inquire what you are doing to resolve our predicament?" "We believed it to be an army matter, sir. Thus far I have left it in Major Ballard's most capable hands. He seemed quite content with the arrangement. Indeed, I would go so far as to say it was by his design. We offered to assist, yet we were quite forcibly rebuffed." Ballard snorted in derision. "I did not seek your assistance, as you had nothing to offer. Every man jack in this damned army was brought here on your ships, yet you claim to have no damn idea who anyone is." "I fail to see how that has any bearing on the matter." Featherstone's reply was icy. "There is no need for the Navy to be here, sir." Ballard turned away from the Commodore and faced Stalker. "They clearly have nothing of relevance to pass on." "The General has asked for their assistance." Ballard looked like he had been slapped in the face. "I hardly think that is necessary, sir." "Well, the General does." Stalker was curt. "You are in no position to argue." "I believe it to be an eminently sensible course of action." Featherstone preened with self-importance. "Thus far the army has failed. It is time to let the Navy sort this mess out." "You would say that." Ballard scowled. Jack sat forward in his chair. He would not stay silent any longer. Did the Navy not come to the same conclusion? That the information we discovered pointed to the man they themselves had identified? He stared at Featherstone sharply as he spoke. The Commodore had been the source of Jack's intelligence, yet he was giving no sign of accepting an iota of responsibility. Featherstone simply smiled. "I cannot think why you would say that. Would you care to explain?" "You know damn well what I mean." Jack felt the futility of the argument, but he could not let Ballard fight alone. Stalker slammed his fist onto his makeshift desk. "Enough of this damn bickering!" "Sir," Jack ignored the warning, "I believe Commodore Featherstone knows exactly what I mean. His own intelligence pointed to the same suspect." Featherstone remained calm. "The plans that are being leaked pertain to the Army and its operations. To date, these have not been the direct concern of naval intelligence. Captain Fenris is merely trying to palm off some of the blame." "How very convenient," Ballard sneered. "I do not think you are in any position to be so damn high and mighty, Ballard," Stalker intervened. "Featherstone is quite correct. It was an army matter. But I promise you this, that is not the case any longer." "What do you mean?" Ballard's face flushed as his own temper rose. "What I mean, Major Ballard, is that I'm handing the matter over to naval intelligence." "Sir!" Ballard rose to his feet. "You cannot do that. It is not in their remit to—" Stalker cut him off in mid-sentence. "I can do what I bloody want. You and your chum here fucked up. You told the General you had rid him of the enemy spies, and he believed you. We would never have embarked on this expedition if we had known the truth." Ballard slumped back into his chair. He had nothing more to say. "I will require the Army's files." Featherstone was not slow to twist a knife. All of them? Ballard could not bring himself to speak. He nodded, his mouth clenched tight shut. "You'd better get this sorted, Featherstone." Stalker had not completely forgotten which branch of the Queen's forces he belonged to. "The Navy must find this canker and rip it out." Featherstone smiled. "I think you can leave us to handle the affair, sir. I trust you'll order Major Ballard to offer me every assistance." "Of course." Stalker's reply was clipped. "Then I see no reason why we cannot resolve this deplorable situation." "You had better. This has been one colossal waste of time." Stalker prowled around the operations tent, which had been emptied of his staff officers while he dealt with the thorny problem that Outram had thrust into his lap. "We are going to march back to Bashir, taking as much of this damn junk as we can. Then at least we can claim this bloody march as some sort of victory. I am certain the army will find something satisfactory to write into the dispatches." Featherstone's sarcasm was biting. "You usually do." He stood up, signalling the end of the meeting, and nodded to Stalker before sweeping out of the tent. His own victory was complete. Ballard made to rise to his feet too, but Stalker waved him back into his place. The three officers watched Featherstone leave in silence. Only when he was gone did Stalker speak again. "Well, gentlemen, I must offer you my sincerest bloody thanks. I assure you I like nothing better than letting that fucking Webfoot think he's got one over on us." The general's sarcasm was biting. Ballard opened his mouth to protest, only to shut it again as Stalker fixed him with a thunderous stare. "From now on, counterintelligence is the Navy's business. You are not to be involved at all. Is that clear?" Ballard looked like he was sucking on a lemon. "Yes, sir." "Your role will be to analyze the incoming intelligence regarding the enemy's activities. Nothing more." "Sir." Ballard simply nodded, barely able to speak. Stalker turned his baleful glare upon Jack. "Captain Fenris, do not think I overlook your role in all of this. You are to report to Captain Hunter immediately." He turned away before he had finished, as if speaking to Jack was distasteful. "You are to be reassigned." Ballard was back on his feet in a heartbeat. "Sir, Captain Fenris is on my staff. He should not be reassigned without my permission." "You lost that right when you fucked this up." Stalker was cruel in his denial. "Fenris will be posted to the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry. Poor Mallet was killed at Rashir. That leaves them short of senior officers, and I'm damned if I'll allow a captain of hussars to sit around on his fucking ass when there is proper soldiering to be done." Ballard looked at Jack. There was nothing further to be said. Chapter 28. "Captain Fenris to see you, sir." The young cornet announced the arrival of the regiment's newest officer with the calm assurance of a junior officer familiar with his superior. "Thank you, Coombe." The razor-thin officer who had been seated behind a camp desk leapt to his feet. Both men wore the smart uniform of the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry. Even after days on campaign, their light blue tunics were immaculate, and the dark blue overalls with the thick yellow stripe down the seam looked freshly pressed. Jack took in the detail as he waited for his new commanding officer's own rapid scrutiny to be completed, pleased to see that his adopted regiment was maintaining its standards even on campaign. The cavalry commander smiled thinly at Jack. "Welcome. I'm Forbes. I'm running the show here." Jack shook the hand offered towards him and felt the discomfort of joining a new body of men. The last time he had done so, he had been revealed as a charlatan within days. He just hoped his assumed identity would last a little longer this time. "I'm glad you could join us." Forbes was trying to sound genial. "After Colonel Mallet fell, we have been a little short. We've all been stepping up, but I must say I was glad when I heard you were coming our way. Perhaps our luck has changed." Jack did his best to hide his uneasiness. The commander of the Bombay Lights was being welcoming enough, but there was a terse tone underlying his greeting. Forbes would be unlikely to relish the arrival of a newcomer into his regiment, especially as he had only just taken command following the death of Lieutenant Colonel Mallet during the attack on Rashir. New men were always an unknown quantity, and any threat to the stability of the regiment was to be avoided if at all possible. "I'm sorry not to have joined you at a better time." Jack was uncomfortable. He had never served with light cavalry before. He had been taught how to ride by the son of a Maharaja, and had even ostensibly commanded a regiment of lancers in the father's service. But that did not qualify him to lead British irregulars. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. "Now then, there is no sense in shilly-shallying." Forbes did his best to force his face into some semblance of a smile. He cast a final, somewhat longing glance at the pile of papers he had been working on before giving Jack his full attention. "As you probably know, we have 2 squadrons, both made up of 4 troops. As of today, our strength is 243 sabres. We're down on numbers, but on the whole, we're in good shape. The men are in fine fettle, and I am lucky that the officers know what they're about. We've been fortunate to avoid many changes in recent months, so we all know each other and rub along nicely." He gave Jack a pointed stare as he spoke. There was a warning veiled behind the cursory introduction. Jack would do well not to rock the boat. "I think you would be best suited to staying with me as my second. The squadrons are all settled, and the men acquitted themselves well in the affair at Rashir. Young Moore is doing a good job as adjutant, and I'm reluctant to change things around on the hoof, so to speak." Forbes forced out a half-smile at his tired pun. "Very well, sir." Jack nodded his agreement. He saw no value in saying anything else. In his time he had been an ordinary redcoat, a fusilier, a lancer, and a hussar. He would now join the irregular cavalry. Only time would tell if he would be any good at it. The darkness wrapped its arms around the cavalry vedette, crushing them in its cloying embrace. Its ominous presence pressed against their senses. It was impossible to see more than a dozen yards. Shapes that in daylight would have meant nothing became fear-inducing shadows, every moving shape a potential enemy, every figment of an overactive imagination a threat to the slumbering army. "Fancy a nip, sir?" Jack tore his eyes from a patch of darkness that had seemed to be growing in size the longer he stared at it. The commander of the vedette, Lieutenant Ross Moore, was offering him a small silver hip flask. "You may find the contents a little unsophisticated, but at the very least it staves off the chill." Jack accepted the flask and took a cautious sip of its contents. The lieutenant had been correct. The rough brandy caught at the back of his throat, but he was grateful for the fire it ignited in his belly. The days might have been hot, but the nights quickly got cold. It was not something he had really noticed when serving on the staff. The tent he had shared with Ballard had been warm and snug. Now he was back at the sharp end of the campaign. He would have to make the best of it, no matter what the conditions. He nodded in appreciation of the friendly gesture. "Thank you." "Think nothing of it, old man. It's my brother Arthur's, anyway. He doesn't know I took it." "Your brother is here?" Moore took a mouthful of the brandy, puffing his cheeks out as he sucked down the fiery liquid before replying. They call him the young Moore. He's our adjutant. I had no idea I was joining a family firm. Jack's discomfort had yet to release him. He was amongst strangers and it had put him on his guard. It also made him sound somewhat caustic, and he regretted the bile in his reply the moment he said it. Oh, I know we're not as grand a regiment as the 15th, but we are a tight bunch, and we know what we're about. Jack saw the glimmer of annoyance in the way Moore narrowed his eyes as he spoke. He tried to lighten the mood. I meant no offence. Of course not, old man. None taken. It must be hard being a fish out of water. I know how I would feel if I got dumped into the middle of a group of bally-hussars. Jack nodded his head in acknowledgement of Moore's understanding. I'm glad to be here. Truly, it's better than being on the damn staff. The lieutenant threw his head back and barked a short laugh at Jack's candour. He was a handsome young man, and something of a Goliath. He must have stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with a broad, muscular frame. He wore his beard full, but it was neatly trimmed and clearly tended with pride. The eyes above the thick bush of hair twinkled with a devilish spirit. Well said, that man. He tucked the flask away in the inside pocket of his light blue tunic. The small patrol of cavalrymen was hidden in a fold in the ground a good quarter of a mile from the Persian encampment that had become the Expeditionary Force's temporary home. Captain Forbes had suggested that Jack join the men charged with warnings of any enemy attack. Major Ballard had written at length to describe the Persians' favourite tactic of launching a night attack against an unsuspecting enemy. His stock might have fallen with the generals, but Outram had still heeded his warning and doubled the usual chain of pickets, pushing his cavalry vedettes far into the darkness of the surrounding plain. Jack had been a bystander as Moore placed his chain of vedettes, each pair positioned close enough to one another so they could remain in sight, even in the gloom. Moore had kept 6 men back to form the patrol that would prowl along the line, checking that his men stayed alert and in place whilst keeping the Bombay Lights in contact with the other cavalry vedettes on their flanks. It was no easy feat in the darkness, and it had been a relief when Moore had ordered a halt and let the small patrol take a breather from being in the saddle, although he was still cautious enough to leave 2 men on guard to watch the nearest pair of sentries. It had already been a long, nerve-shredding night. Jack had peered into the darkness and seen all manner of danger, yet Moore had seemed totally at ease, and Jack had done his best to match the junior officer's calm sang-froid. The men of the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry were clearly used to their duties, going about their work with a quiet competence. They needed few orders, and from what Jack could see, the Daffadar in charge had his troopers well in hand. There was little for the officers to do, and Jack felt like a spare part simply brought along for the ride. Sahib! The sudden call brought him sharply to his senses. One of Moore's men was pointing into the darkness. Jack screwed up his eyes and did his best to find what it was that had startled the sentry into action. He could see nothing. Lieutenant Moore jogged across to stand at the sentry's shoulder. He stood almost on eye level with the trooper, even though the man was mounted and Moore was on foot. What do you see? Was he a Khan? The trooper swallowed hard as he felt his commander's presence at his shoulder. But he was a steady man, and when he spoke, his reply was clear and precise. There, Sahib. Number 5 vedette. Jack stared hard into the darkness. He followed the direction of the pointed arm and saw a pair of troopers walking their horses in a tight circle to the right. It was the signal that meant they had spotted the approach of cavalry. Had they been turning to the left, it would have meant they had spied infantry. If each man turned in a different direction, it meant that the widely spaced vedettes faced a mixed force. Lieutenant Moore had recognised the signal in a heartbeat. He walked forward quickly before going down on his knees and pressing his ear to the ground. He listened intently before bounding to his feet with surprising grace for such a large man. "Time to mount the boys." The lieutenant jogged across to where he had hobbled his horse next to Jack's own. He flashed Jack a smile. "Might be nothing, but we cannot be too careful. My brother would never let me forget it if I cocked up." Jack nodded in agreement and made to mount his own horse. He felt a flutter of fear deep in his belly. It was up to the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry to discover what had disturbed the night. The noise of moving horses echoed around them as the patrol mounted quickly and without fuss, the men pausing only to tighten their horses' girths, which they had loosened off when they had been allowed to rest. The jangle of tackle was loud, and Jack could not help but think that the cavalrymen were doing a fine job of announcing themselves to any enemy that was daring to encroach on the slumbering British camp. He turned and was about to say as much to Moore when he heard something else. He cocked his ear, straining his hearing as he tried to pick out a sound amidst the noise of the patrol. There was no mistaking it. It was the noise of hooves drumming on the hard-baked sand of the plain. It was the sound of cavalrymen on the move. Above them the clouds had begun to thin out, and for the first time a small amount of starlight was filtering through the sky. It was still too dark to see clearly, but there was no mistaking the shadowy forms that were silhouetted against the far horizon. Lieutenant Moore rode close to Jack's shoulder. On horseback the man looked like a hero from an ancient fable. His horse was huge, and the pair loomed over Jack so that he was forced to angle his head far back as he told his subordinate what he had seen. "There's movement. Away to the west." Moore listened for a moment, then nodded his head in agreement. He turned and signalled to the daffadar. The patrol had formed into 2 lines behind the pair of officers, and now they drew their swords. The rasp of the metal being withdrawn from their scabbards could have been heard for hundreds of yards, but there was no longer any value in remaining hidden. If the enemy was close, then the Bombay Lights wanted to be ready for a fight. Jack drew his own sword. The blade felt snug in his hand, the familiar weight reassuring. He twisted in the saddle and looked at the line of men behind him. He saw the steadiness in the ranks, only the movement of the horses spoiling the stillness of the troop. Moore raised his hand. Behind him the men tightened their grip on the reins, preparing to respond to the order he was about to give. The young officer waited. The small gap in the cloud closed, plunging the men back into almost complete darkness. The shadowy figures disappeared, hidden by the gloom, yet the sound of their movement was still clear. There could be no doubt that another troop of cavalry was moving through the night. Jack eased his horse forward, peering into the black. "Can you see them?" Moore's voice was hoarse. "I can't see a bloody thing." Jack said nothing but continued to walk his horse on. His mind remembered a battle on a faraway hillside. The redcoats had just captured the enemy's great redoubt when a column had advanced against them. In the confusion of battle it had been hard to identify the nationality of the soldiers, the smoke of the battlefield obscuring the detail of their uniform. When panicky shouts had announced the arrival of their French allies, no one had been certain enough to gainsay the command to hold fire. It had been a dreadful mistake. The column had been Russian, and the redcoats had broken, abandoning what had been hard won without a fight. Jack was not about to let history repeat itself. "Are they ours or theirs?" Moore hissed the question, his anxiety clear. Jack turned in the saddle and fixed his gaze on the enormous lieutenant. "Stay here." Without another word, he spurred into the darkness. The ground flashed by underneath the hooves of his fast-moving horse. Jack could barely see anything, yet he urged his mount to pick up speed. He felt the fear build in his belly, squirming and twisting in his guts, but he forced it to be still, ignoring the icy flush that poured through every fibre of his being. If the cavalry they had seen were indeed the enemy, Jack was likely to be riding to his death. He pulled up hard, yanking on the reins to bring his horse to a halt. He saw the shapes of men close ahead. He knew they must be able to see him. He was close enough to hear the noises of their horses. He gripped his sword, screwing his courage tight, steadying himself so he was ready to fight. He heard the murmur of a language he did not understand in the low tones of men trying to remain quiet. He planned for the fight he thought was inevitable. He would throw himself forward, trusting to surprise to keep him safe, gambling on a desperate, lonely charge as his only hope of survival. It was worth the risk. He would not sit idly by and watch another disaster unfurl around him. The mysterious force simply had to be identified, and Jack had endured enough of sitting on the sidelines. He bunched the reins into his left hand and sucked in a last mouthful of the sweet night air. He prepared himself to spur hard into his horse's flanks, his muscles tensing as he braced for the charge. "Come forward and be identified." The clipped tones took him by surprise. He nearly gouged his spurs back regardless, so keyed up was he to fight. It took him a moment to force himself to breathe, to let the tension leave his body. With a deep sigh, he thrust his sword back into its scabbard. "Fenris, Bombay lights." He saw the shadowy form of a rider emerge from the blackness, the white of his face bright in the flickering starlight. "Now there's a spot of luck. We nearly shot you." The cavalry that had caused Jack so much trepidation emerged from the gloom. They wore long, dark blue tunics with wide red sashes. Jack recognized the uniform of the Poona Horse, the other cavalry regiment at Outram's disposal. He heard the jangle of horse tackle behind him as Moore's troopers advanced. Jack turned and waved to the lieutenant, summoning him forward. He sat deep in his saddle and breathed in a deep lungful of the cool night air, feeling the nerves flutter deep in his belly. It would take time to settle them down and still the tremor in his hands. He thought of the risk he had taken and shivered, cursing at his own foolishness. He was acting like a griffin. He saw Moore's furrowed brow as he brought his patrol forward. There could be no doubt that the younger officer was not impressed. There was no place for heroics on the front line. Foolish actions cost lives. Jack knew he would have to do better if he was to make a new home for himself with the Bombay lights. Chapter 29. A door? I'm not jesting, I swear. Why would anyone think a door posed a threat? Ballard steepled his fingers and contemplated the outrageous tale. Jack had sought out his former commander and had discovered him in a corner of Stalker's operations tent, half hidden behind a stack of paperwork. He had greeted Ballard with the tale of a vedette from the Poona Horse that had nearly set the whole camp to alarm when one of their nervous troopers mistook a discarded door as an enemy about to attack. It made for a better tale than the one about a foolish cavalry officer who had come close to charging headlong into a vedette from his own side. It was pitch black. He sighed as he was forced to explain the story, quite spoiling its effect. They couldn't see what it was. God, you do know how to suck the life out of a tale. It was meant to be amusing. Still, Ballard shook his head. He was obviously not convinced that Jack's story was true, and he clearly found nothing remotely humorous in a tale of such rank incompetence. Not even I would think of a door as a threat. Jack sighed at the Major's ability to pick the bones out of everything he heard. He'd hoped the light-hearted story would put a smile on Ballard's face, but he had been disappointed. I take it things haven't improved here, then? He pulled over a camp chair and sat down heavily. Is it bad? Bad? Ballard tasted the bland word. It was sour. It's not bad. It's bloody awful. They don't even invite me in when Featherstone arrives to deliver his reports. They've cut me dead. But you're still called on to advise on the enemy's movements. What enemy? The buggers appear to have disappeared. They are hiding up in the hills, daring us to attack them. Will we? Jack was all ears. Now that he was back at the army's sharp end, he was keen to know if he faced a fight. No. That much I do know. Ballard tossed his steel pen to one side and pushed his chair back. We are going back to Bashir. The orders are being drafted even as we speak. We will march tomorrow, taking what supplies we can. The rest will be blown to high heaven to deny it to the enemy. So, we scurry back to Bashir with our tails between our legs. Nonsense! Ballard stood up and grabbed his cap from the corner of his desk. In camp, the officers wore their undress uniform, which meant that the two officers could forgo the heavy busby that made the hussars so distinctive. The small, light cap with its scarlet top was much more comfortable for daily wear. The busby would only be worn if they went back into action, something that seemed to have become a great deal less likely now that the Persian general had retreated into the hills. I've seen Outram's dispatch. Ballard stood beside his desk, as if reluctant to leave the reports he had been working on. This has been a glorious expedition that has put a serious dent in our enemy's ambition to counter our presence here. It is a success, Jack. A resounding success. He closed his eyes as if in sudden pain. When he opened them again, he fixed Jack with a hard, flat stare. Come on, let's go and find a drink. I need some fresh air. The two officers made their way out of the bell tent that was the centre of Stalker's divisional operations. Outside, the early morning light was warming away the chill of the night, and the army was waking to a day of hard toil as they prepared to march back to Bashir. If Ballard was indeed correct, the next few hours would be spent loading whatever provisions they could onto the collection of mismatched carts and wagons that was all the commissariat could find in the local villages. The infantry would be pressed into service as temporary porters, and for the first time Jack was glad that he now served in a cavalry regiment. You understand this spy business is not finished. Ballard opened the conversation as they made their way from the bustling encampment and headed towards the Major's private tent. I didn't want to talk of it back there. There are too many beady eyes and eager ears. I thought it had all been passed to Featherstone. Jack was wary in the face of Ballard's statement. The commander of the intelligence department had a worrying intensity about him. Jack had been in the army long enough to know that that was never a good sign in a senior officer. And what if it has? Ballard was gruff as Jack was quick to remind him of the shame of their failure. Do you think it wise to become involved in something that no longer concerns you? Jack asked the question pointedly. He wanted no part in the scheme he sensed Ballard was dreaming up. Of course it still damn well concerns me. Ballard shook his head as Jack questioned his reasoning. Just because Stalker stomps and shouts doesn't mean I have to let it all go. I rather think he made his point of view clear. Jack sensed danger. Ballard was clearly close to disobeying Stalker's orders. He's given the whole damn thing to Featherstone. You're a fool if you intend to meddle. Ballard looked sharply at Jack. I am no fool. You would do well to remember that. Jack saw something of the man who had abducted him from the streets of Bombay. It was a reminder of how precarious his position was. It was easy to forget that he owed everything, including his continued survival, to the intelligence officer. I apologize. I'm merely concerned for your career. Ballard waved the remark away, but Jack knew he had been warned. So, what do we know? Jack asked the question gingerly. For the first time, Ballard smiled. I have discovered a little. I may be out of favour, but Captain Hunter is a good fellow, and he tells me what he can." The mention of Stalker's aid made Jack think of Sarah's gossip. Hunter's family had been disgraced. Was that enough to make a man turn his coat and spy for the enemy? He shook his head to clear his mind of the notion. It was not the time for idle speculation. He tried to concentrate on Ballard's news. "I have learned that the enemy have a Russian officer in their ranks." Ballard continued to share what he had discovered. "We don't know his name, but we think he comes direct from the Tsar. We know very little about him, although rumour has it that he is a hard bastard who fought us in the Crimea. He makes no attempt to hide. He serves on the staff of the Persian general Shuja-ul-Mulk. We think he is the ringleader, the spy master, if you will. Whoever our spy is, he sends his reports direct to this man, who can then pass on whatever he pleases to the Persian command." Ballard scowled as he summarized the situation for Jack's benefit. "The presence of this Russian complicates matters. It means that not only do the Persians seem to know our every move, but they get the information from the Russians, which can only further increase their damned influence here." "Perhaps we should pop over to the Persian camp and ask the bugger what he's playing at." Jack chuckled at the idea, but the look on Ballard's face silenced him quickly. He would not put it past the intelligence officer to be contemplating exactly that. "No, we cannot do that." Ballard eventually conceded the idea. "But we can finish the job we were given. This is my mess. I fully intend to be the one who sorts it out." They arrived outside Ballard's tent, where Palmer was seated on a stool, sharpening a knife. The bodyguard looked up as they approached, a wry smile on his face as he saw Jack. "So, you're back." "He is not staying," Ballard was quick to reply. Palmer grunted. He clearly did not care one way or the other. Ballard turned to face Jack. His face was serious. "Just because you've buggered off to the Bombay Lights doesn't mean this isn't your fight too. Do not think I've forgotten your role in apprehending the spy. If you had not rushed in, perhaps we would have unravelled the whole sorry mess." "You don't know that. And the poor bastard revealed nothing when your man there got his hands on him." Perhaps." Ballard frowned. "We shall never know. So, your orders—" "I'm not sure I can help," Jack interrupted. He could sense where the conversation was headed. He may have been seconded to the light cavalry, but he had been wrong to think his tie to Ballard had been severed. Like it or not, the Major still held the reins to his future. "You cannot wash your hands of me that easily." Ballard flashed his thin, wolfish excuse for a smile. "Or have you forgotten who you really are?" Jack grimaced as he felt his past tighten around him. "I see. I'm glad you do. Now, when we get our asses back to Bashir, I want you to talk to Sarah Draper or her brother. They seem to have Featherstone's ear. See what they know." Jack smiled at the notion. He had missed Sarah more than he'd thought possible. His thoughts were no longer solely lustful. He had begun to sense that they shared more than just a physical connection. The idea of seeing her again and asking her to help him once more sat well in his mind. "I'll try." "You'd better do a damn sight more than that." Ballard scowled at Jack's meek answer. "I'll be damned if I leave that bloody Webford to make a mess of this. You and I will discover the identity of these bloody spies, and then you can do what I brought you here to do." He fixed Jack with a determined stare. "We will find out who is betraying us, and you will kill them." The army marched that night. The screech of the ungreased axles on the simple peasant carts grated on the ears of the redcoats, the dreadful cacophony underscoring the sound of hundreds of men marching. Every type of conveyance had been pressed into service as the British attempted to take away as much of the vast amount of supplies as they possibly could. The carts and wagons slowed progress. the heavily laden transport dictating the pace so that the column was forced to halt repeatedly, the delays adding to the frustration of the men who had marched so far to fight, only to be denied by the enemy's refusal to meet them in battle. The long trudge back to the main forces' base at Bashir began in silence, every man aware of the long, difficult route they must follow over the coming days and nights. Their officers had promised an easy pace, the need for speed long since gone, yet the redcoats were wise to the ways of their commanders and knew how quickly the situation could change. They had spent the day piling up the supplies they could not carry into a single heap in the very middle of the enemy's meagre encampment. It was enormous, a man-made mountain. At its base were stacked the hundreds of barrels of black powder they could not hope to take back to Bashir. The whole lot was to be fired, Outram ordering its destruction to garner some credit from the wasted march. The detonation was entrusted to two officers from the engineers, Lieutenant Gibbard and Lieutenant Hassard. They planned to use a pair of Jacob's shells, a new type of exploding ammunition, the brainchild of Major John Jacob. A copper percussion tube filled with fulminate of mercury was contained in the forepart of the bullet and would explode on impact, igniting the shell behind. The new ammunition promised much. If it worked, it would allow riflemen to annihilate any field battery of artillery from a distance, something that would revolutionize the battlefield. If it worked. The ammunition was still very much at an experimental stage, and this would be one of the first occasions it had been used in anger. The British might be retreating, but they would at least depart with a bang. The blast split the night asunder, the roar rolling over the marching redcoats in a dreadful explosion of violence. As one, the column halted, turning to stare at the spectacle. A single column of flame leapt into the sky, like a fiery finger pointing in accusation at the gods who had denied the British the battle they had so desired. It seared through the darkness, banishing the night and lighting the sky so that the world was bathed in a warm orange glow. Cloud after cloud of bright silvery smoke billowed from the base of the flames, rolling out at a terrific rate so that it smothered the entire encampment, before rushing on to blanket the town of Borajun. Explosions punctured the smoke cloud as the enemy's stores of ammunition went up. Each burst like a sky rocket in a shower of sparks and flame, punching a hole in the heavy smoke for a single heartbeat before disappearing, only the flicker of falling shards a legacy of its brief but vibrant display. The concussion of the massive explosion shook the ground. The soil under the redcoats' boots seemed to shimmer, the very fibre of the earth shaken by the powder of the exploding black powder. The weary infantry looked at the fabulous scene created by their engineers and saw nothing but shame, their failure displayed to the world. The order to resume the march echoed down the column. The redcoats ignored the fiery mountain and trudged on into the night, turning their backs on the legacy of their daring incursion into the enemy's heartland. The Persian army watched the British depart. They had seen their supplies go up in flame, their encampment laid waste by the single massive explosion. They saw the men who had invaded their homeland marching away, the long columns snaking for miles across the flat, barren landscape. They sensed fear in the retreat, the hated pale-faced foreigners and their native levies lacking the courage to face them in battle. As the invaders' column made its way away from Borajun, the Persian army appeared from the safety of the hills and set off after the enemy, huge blocks of infantry marching in close column, whilst vast swarms of cavalry led them forward and pressed close to the rear of the retreating British. The force the Shah had assembled was easily twice the size of the British column. 5,000 infantrymen of the Karagoslu, Shiraz and Tabriz regiments, the best soldiers in the Persian army, marched with pride, their ranks dressed and ordered just as their British instructors had once taught them. Nigh on 2,000 cavalrymen of the Sufengis, the Shiraz cavalry, and the Alkan horse were ready to pounce on the enemy, the handful of cavalry at the foreign general's disposal a mere morsel that could be snapped up and devoured before the Persians took their sabres against the broken ranks of the red-coated infantry. Shuja-ul-Mulk would not let the invaders skulk away unmolested. He had bided his time, waiting for the moment to strike. Now he watched the undefended column and the tiny rearguard that protected it. He saw the opportunity, and he thought of the victory his master the Shah so desired. The British army would not be left to retreat in peace. They would get the battle they had marched so far to find. Chapter 30. The enemy came out of the blackness. Their screams echoed across the plain, drowning out the sound of their galloping horses. The cries swirled around the British rearguard so that it seemed as if they were being attacked from all sides. The suddenness of the attack shook the men of the 3rd Bombay Light Cavalry. They had expected a dull, routine march back to Bashir. They were roused from their lethargy by an eruption of violence, the vicious war cries of the Persian cavalry leaving no doubt that their complacency had been ill-founded. The column was under attack. The first shots rang out. They snapped through the air, stinging past the ears of the light cavalry protecting the last of the marching infantry. The gunfire drove any indecision from the minds of the officers charged with the security of the column. It was time for action. The rearguard would be the first to fight, their job to protect the column long enough for the infantry to reform and face the enemy threat. "Fenris, with me!" Jack heard Captain Forbes bellow his name. He turned his horse round and spurred it hard, chasing after the commander of the Bombay Lights. He had been lost in his thoughts, imagining his reunion with Sarah Draper, even though it would likely mean another clash with her arrogant prig of a brother. He emerged from his reverie to the chaos of an ambush. He saw fast-moving shapes in the darkness as the enemy swarmed around the rearguard. The Persians were screaming and yelling like fiends, the dreadful cries seeming somehow inhuman, as if the column was under attack from the denizens of another world. Their frantic trumpets blared out, the strange calls piercing his ears and scattering his thoughts as he tried to make sense of the confusion that had erupted from the dark. He reined in hard next to Forbes. There was just enough moonlight to make out the light blue tunics of the troopers as they reformed their ranks to face outwards into the night. He saw Moore, the adjutant, riding away from his commander, bearing away the first report of the contact to the senior officers who would need to know of the sudden threat to the marching column. "Take number 5 and 6 troop. Protect the left flank." Forbes snapped the order at Jack. Another flurry of shots stung the air around them, and both officers flinched, the sudden strain of being under fire written large on their faces. "The Poona horse have the right flank. I shall hold the rest of the regiment here to protect the rear. Is that all clear?" "Sir." Jack acknowledged the order. He was about to ram his spurs back when Forbes grabbed his shoulder. "And for God's sake, keep the enemy away from the column. Whatever it takes, we cannot let them past." Jack nodded and galloped towards the ranks of the Bombay Lights. "5 and 6 troop with me." He glanced along the length of the line and saw the older Moore acknowledge the order. He looked for the officer in charge of the other troop he had been ordered to command. A thin-faced lieutenant raised his hand. John Malcolmson, an officer Jack barely knew. It was a pity their introduction to one another would come in such dangerous circumstances. He brought his horse to a stand so he could watch his men as they responded to his orders. The animal pranced and skittered, sensing the building tension, and Jack had to work hard to keep it in hand. He forced the beast into a tight circle and observed the Daffodars issuing their orders to their men as they prepared to take the 2 troops out of the formation. He looked for signs of panic or confusion, but the men responded calmly, their stony faces betraying none of the excitement the sudden attack must surely have caused. He was impressed. He just hoped they were as calm in a fight. "Follow me!" Jack waved his arm and signalled the two troops to move to the left flank. His horse tried to gallop away and he was forced to haul on the reins to keep it in hand. He heard the drumming of hooves behind him as the troops followed his command, and he hoped the darkness saved the men from seeing their commander wrestling to control his horse like a raw recruit fresh from the depot. He led the men quickly towards the column's left flank, or at least where he believed the left flank to be. In the darkness it was nigh on impossible to know exactly where anyone was. He brought them into position, formed into a single line, 2 men deep, so that they could screen the tail of the column from attack. He could hear the first shouted orders as the infantry awoke to the sudden threat. They would need time to reform. In the column of march, they would be unable to fight back and repel the sudden ambush. The formation was perfect for advancing across country, the men moving in one solid, compact oblong, but it was vulnerable to attack. They needed to reorganize themselves into a square, the one formation that would protect them from the ravages of enemy horsemen. With a wall of bayonets facing out on all 4 sides, the infantry would be secure, the ring of steel certain to force any attacking cavalry to veer away. It was a tactic that had worked for Wellington, and it would work for the British generals who had learned from the old Duke. The light cavalry would have to buy the infantry the time they would need to complete the change in formation, no matter what it cost them. If they failed, the infantry would be easy targets for the hard-riding Persian cavalry. They would be butchered, the mournful retreat turned into a rout, the campaign coming to a bloody end with an ignominious defeat. A bugle sounded from the darkness. Its rising call demanded attention, the signal to retire clear even over the dreadful cacophony of the enemy's screams and yells. Jack looked in every direction, trying to find the source of the urgent call. He twisted in the saddle and saw his own trumpeters lifting their instruments to their mouths, their instincts telling them to echo the order. "Hold fast!" he bellowed. The rising call came again, the notes sounding with absolute clarity. There was no mistaking the command. "Should we retire?" Lieutenant Moore had raced forward so that he could call to Jack. His face was etched with tension. "No. It's a trick." Jack forced himself to smile. "Hold the men here. 2 lines facing west. Quick now. We're not going to stay here for long. We need to drive these bastards off." Moore looked at Jack, a moment of doubt showing in his expression, but he turned away and bellowed the orders to the 2 troops. Jack could feel dozens of eyes boring into his back as he tried to discern the enemy in the darkness. He was sure he had made the correct decision. He had read enough reports of the Persian army to know that they had been trained for many years by British officers. It was natural to assume that the enemy trumpeters would know the British army's bugle calls, and he was certain that the command to retire had come from out of the darkness and not from the direction of the British column. He pushed the doubts away and summoned the courage to trust his instincts. He would not obey the orders of the enemy. A volley of gunfire shattered the calm. The bullets whistled past him, the air suddenly alive with the storm of deadly missiles. A single trooper slumped from the saddle, his left arm shattered by a ball fired from an enemy carbine. The darkness was saving the men from taking more casualties. The enemy horsemen were armed with carbines and were wasting their time delivering weak volleys of gunfire when they should have been pressing home their attack and relying on cold, hard steel. Jack intended to show them just how light cavalry should fight, a demonstration that he hoped would shatter the enemy's ranks and buy the British column some much-needed time. "Draw sabres!" He faced his new command, parading his horse in front of the troopers, showing them that he was braving the danger. There was enough moonlight filtering through the thin clouds for them to see their new captain, to witness the example he was trying to set. He felt his shoulder blades twitch as he turned his back on the enemy. A cold rush of fear surged down his spine before settling in the nagging pain in the small of his back. He forced it from his mind, concentrating on watching his men. He might have only just learned the sequences of commands the British cavalry employed, but this was what he was used to. He knew how to fight. The sabres flashed in the meagre light. The Bombay lights were issued with straight, heavy swords. They were brutal weapons, the steel capable of cutting through a man's flesh with ease. The troopers endured countless hours of training as they built up the strength they would need to be able to wield the swords effectively in combat, a skill Jack was about to put to the test. He studied the ranks of faces staring towards him, his eyes roving across the men who had fallen under his command. He saw their determination, the grim set of their jaws as they braced themselves for what was about to come. Moore had ordered them into 2 lines, each 2 men deep. The second line had pushed to the rear, leaving a gap between it and the front rank. The men had reformed quickly, without fuss. For the first time, Jack felt a spark of pride at leading them into battle. He drew his own sword. The tulwar rasped from the scabbard, and he brandished it high in the air, letting every man see the fabulous weapon. A young trooper rode forward, taking his place at Jack's side. His face was pale in the darkness, his eyes wide. He held a trumpet in his hand, and Jack could see the whites of the boy's knuckles as he held the instrument in a vice-like grip. "Stay close, lad. Watch for my command." Jack spoke softly so that only the young trumpeter could hear him. He looked into the boy's eyes and saw the fear bright inside them. Slowly and deliberately he turned his horse on the spot so that he once again faced the darkness. He could see the shadowy forms of the enemy horsemen as they prowled around the rearguard. It told him all he needed to know. He lowered his sword, pointing it forward. "Bombay Lights!" His voice was huge, his hidden terror given voice. "March!" He tapped his heels into the flanks of his willing horse, keeping the bit rammed hard into the animal's mouth, curbing its instincts to race away. The 2 lines of cavalry lurched into motion behind him, the men obeying his orders without hesitation. "Trot!" The rhythm of the hooves pounding into the sun-baked soil changed as the men hastened their speed. The line was moving rapidly now, pulling away from the rearguard, advancing into the dark. "Gallop!" Jack pushed his spurs backwards, urging his horse on, yet still keeping the bit hard in its mouth, holding it back, keeping it in hand. "Charge!" He was supposed to give the final command when the enemy was no more than 40 to 50 yards distant. In the darkness it was impossible to tell, but he screamed the order anyway, the need to close with the enemy overriding the need for precision. He racked his spurs back and finally let the bit fall loose, giving the horse its head. The valiant animal threw itself forward. The young trumpeter echoed the order, his instrument blaring the notes of the charge as he raced after his commander. Jack galloped into the darkness. The movement was mesmerizing, the motion of the horse's gait sending a rush of exhilaration flushing through his veins and banishing the last of his fear. He heard the sound of hundreds of hooves hitting the ground as the 2 troops followed his lead and felt a heady rush of excitement, the intoxication of the charge like nothing he'd ever experienced. He looked ahead and saw the shapes of the enemy horsemen scattering in every direction as the sudden charge took them by surprise. He sensed the panic engulfing the Persians. The reversal in fortune so quick that it snatched away their initiative in a heartbeat. He felt the flare of success. He was doing what he did best. A shadowy shape flashed towards him. Without thought, he changed the angle of his horse's charge, his body reacting just as it had been trained to do so many months ago. He brought his tulwar around, acting on instinct, slashing the blade forward, slicing it across the back of the body that had erupted from the darkness. His arm jerked with the impact. He felt the blade slide through flesh before it bounced off bone. He caught the impression of an enemy rider being thrown from the saddle before he was past, the speed of his horse's gallop taking him away from the man he had slain. He heard a visceral thump as his men hit the loose formation of the enemy. They swept on with barely a pause, scything the Persian riders from their saddles, their heavy swords battering the enemy into bloody ruin. There was no time for anything more than the brutal collision. Jack knew he had to halt his men almost immediately. He could not afford for them to become scattered, their cohesion broken as they chased down the enemy horsemen. "Walk!" He bellowed the command, immediately reining in hard, slowing the mad headlong rush. The two troops had covered the ground fast, and already they were some distance from the column they were protecting. The young trumpeter drew up beside him, his instrument already pressed to his lips. Jack lifted his arm high, signalling his command. "Sound the halt." He snapped off the order. The two troops came to a breathless standstill as the bugle called for them to stop. Jack flashed a smile at his trumpeter. In the darkness, the boy's instrument was vital as the only practical way of issuing commands to his men, the youngster's skill the only thing between him and chaos. Jack twisted in the saddle, taking one last look into the darkness. There was no sign of the enemy riders. He nodded at the trumpeter. "Signal retire." It was time to rejoin the column. The Bombay lights had scattered the enemy troops. They had bought their comrades some time to reform. For the moment, that was all they could do. Chapter 31. Jack led his two troops back towards the column. He could sense the men's exhilaration at having charged the enemy, and the horses tossed their heads and snorted loudly as they joined in their master's excitement. He was proud of his new command, and he relished being back where he belonged. At the rear of the column, the 4th Rifles had formed a thin skirmish line facing out into the darkness. Their officers prowled behind the line, steadying the troops, readying them to fight. Ahead, Jack could hear the bugles and drums of the main column. The cumbersome infantry battalions were still reforming, moving out of the column of march and into the square that would protect them from an enemy attack. The column was performing well under the stress of the nighttime ambush, but the change in formation was taking longer than Jack could have imagined. They needed still more time. "Well done, that man!" Jack looked up and saw a mounted officer waving them in, his enthusiastic greeting an unexpected boon. "That's the way, boys. Show them some bloody steel." The officer was clearly delighted at their performance. He lifted his hand in greeting as he saw Jack. "Captain, form your men up on the left, if you please." Jack recognized the voice. He rode forward as his men maneuvered to obey the command, leaving them to the care of their officers. "Good evening, sir." He greeted the army's commander whilst he was still too far away to be properly identified in the dim light. He was pleased to see the general look round, squinting in an attempt to discern Jack's features as he approached. "You!" Jack smiled as he saw the flare of recognition in Outram's eyes. "Yes, sir." "That was fine work, Fenris. Fine work indeed." To Outram's credit, he rallied fast, even remembering Jack's name. He was clearly not going to let Jack's past failure stop him from giving praise where it was due. "The men knew what they were about, sir. I just tagged along for the ride." Outram laughed at his modesty. "You did well. It was just what was needed. I had a feeling you were wasted working with Ballard. You are a man of purpose, Captain Fenris, a man of action. I could see that the moment I clapped eyes on you." Thank you, sir." Jack tried not to look too pleased. "Well, I'm sure you will be given another chance to show what you are made of tonight. This is a nasty business. These buggers seem to know what they're doing." There was no time for Jack to reply. A staff officer rode up to the general, thrusting forward a scrap of paper the moment he came to a halt. Jack rode back to his new command. Outram was right. The enemy were still swarming around the rearguard, their yells and cries building in intensity once again as they reformed. It was only just after midnight. It would be a long night. "Reform the ranks!" Jack gave the order to his trumpeter. The two troops had become more scattered on the third charge, the men's tiredness beginning to have an effect on their cohesion. He felt his own exhaustion pressing down, numbing his brain so that his thoughts became turgid and slow. The call to reform was ragged and uneven, and he flashed an angry glare at the young boy who had been at his side throughout the charges. It was enough of a warning for the youngster to find a reserve of energy, and the call steadied, the note sounding clear once again. For the third time, the two troops trotted back to their station on the left flank of the rearguard. For the last 2 hours they had ridden hard to drive away the enemy cavalry, keeping them at bay. Their frustration was building as quickly as their exhaustion. The enemy had learned fast. They refused to stand and fight, preferring instead to melt into the darkness as soon as the Bombay lights pressed close. Thus far Jack's men had only caught the Persians with their first attack, and they were tiring of the need to reform when they had barely got going. Despite their frustration, Jack was determined to keep them on a tight leash. The British had pitifully few cavalry. They could ill afford to allow two troops to disappear on some fruitless chase into the night. A deep boom resonated through the night sky. The enemy had brought up 4 guns and had begun shelling the halted column shortly after the Bombay Lights' first charge. It was an ill-directed fire, the shells exploding harmlessly away from the column. Yet the constant barrage was wearing away the men's nerves. It had to be only a matter of time before the Persian gunners got lucky and managed to land a shot on target. The column had reformed into an enormous single square, each of the 4 sides facing outward so that no matter where the enemy attacked, they would be greeted by the massed ranks of the British infantry. A single brigade formed each of the long flanks, with a demi-brigade making up the 2 shorter faces at the front and rear. The supply wagons were huddled together in the centre, sheltered from attack by the long walls of rifles and muskets that surrounded them. In this new, tight formation, Outram's men could wait for dawn and for the daylight that would allow them to take the battle to the enemy. "Here they come again, sir," Lieutenant Moore called for Jack's attention. Some of the cloud had been blown away so that more moonlight made its way onto the plain. There was enough to see the enemy cavalry pressing forward again. For the 4th time they approached the rearguard. The screams and yells that had typified the initial attacks were gone, the enemy calmer as the night wore on and the impetus of the early ambush faded. It was as if the Persians had accepted the standoff, and now both sides were reduced to going through the motions as they waited for the dawn and the battle that seemed inevitable. "Prepare the men. Dress the ranks." "Will we charge again, sir?" Moore asked the question cautiously, sounding his captain out. Jack looked closely at the lieutenant. "I see no other option." "The men are tired, sir. So are the horses. We aren't coming close to catching the buggers. Perhaps we can hold our position for the moment. Give everyone time to catch their breath." Jack sighed. He well understood the weariness. "We cannot risk meeting the enemy from a halt if they do decide to charge us. We must have momentum. We have no choice." "Prepare the men to charge again." He gave the order confidently. He was in command. "Yes, sir." Moore accepted the argument. The men are doing well, Ross. You should let them know that. Moore smiled. They're good boys. You mustn't listen to all the nonsense about the company's men being at odds with their officers. I would trust my boys with my very life. Jack heard both pride and complacency in Moore's reply. He had seen how the East India Company officered its native battalions. He had not been impressed. Bombay had resounded with dire tales of the lazy, indolent company officers treating their men with appalling brutality. Talk of discontented Jawans disobeying their officers was becoming commonplace, as was rumour of unrest. The native soldiers' list of complaints was long, from the threat of being forced to serve overseas to the attempts to convert them to Christianity. Jack had seen firsthand how hard the native infantry fought. He had every respect for their ability as soldiers, and he could only wonder at the senior company officers who steadfastly refused to listen to their men's complaints. This was no time for such a political discussion. Jack summoned the energy to sit straight as he gave his next orders. Form the men. Send me the trumpeter. We charge as before. Moore stiffened in the saddle as he acknowledged the command. Very good, sir. Jack's tired squadron would have to fight on. Charge! For the fourth time that night, Jack bellowed the command. The trumpeter picked up the order and blew the rising call beautifully. Despite his exhaustion, Jack felt his body respond to the warlike melody. He did not doubt that the notes would haunt him forever. He could not imagine a time when they would not resonate deep in his soul. His horse went forward willingly. He felt the change in gait as the restraining bit loosened to give the animal its head. Just as before, the enemy turned and raced away. The light had improved as dawn crept ever closer, and Jack got a better look at the men who had plagued the rearguard for so many hours. They were dressed in a similar fashion to their infantry, light blue tunics with red collars and cuffs, and the same white cross belts and popack hats. They were armed with thin lances decorated with scarlet flags. From what little Jack had seen, they were not as well trained as the infantry, their scattered formation easily broken by the disciplined charges of the Bombay Lights. Walk! Jack shouted the order, the words grating in his throat. The Bombay Lights eased their horses into the slower pace, the repetition of the manoeuvre lessening the disappointment at being unable to bring the enemy to meet their sabres. Halt! Reform the ranks! Jack felt the tiredness take hold. He watched his men as they reformed. He could see their exhaustion, their tired mounts having to be worked hard as they were forced back into the ordered ranks. The charge had taken them close to half a mile away from the rest of the rearguard, and Jack wanted to get his small command back to the safety of the main position. But even once back with the other troops, there would be no opportunity for any kind of rest. There were simply too few cavalry with the expeditionary force. The Bombay Lights would have to stay in the saddle until daybreak, and God alone knew what they faced when the morning revealed the full extent of the enemy's preparations. Sir, beware right! Cornet Coombe, stationed in Serfile rank behind 6th Troop, called for his commander's attention, his adolescent voice squeaking as he did so. Jack felt a flutter of fear. His squadron was exposed, its flanks unguarded and open. It was the necessary evil of scattering the enemy cavalry with a short, sharp charge. If a large body of enemy horsemen caught them now, they could be quickly cut off from the rest of the expeditionary force. He forced his horse to a trot. From his position at the centre of the two troops, he couldn't see the threat that placed his new command in danger. Sir! Coombe waved his arm frantically. Cavalry to the east! At last, Jack spotted what had captured his subaltern's attention. A body of enemy horsemen was trying to slip around the flank of the squadron. Sound the retire! He snapped the order at his trumpeter. The boy's eyes widened with fear at the urgency in his officer's voice. He raised the trumpet and tried to sound the order, but his lips were dry and the notes stuttered and died. "Spit, boy, spit!" Jack admonished, knowing full well that any delay placed his men and the rest of the rearguard in danger. The boy did as he was told, his tongue flicking nervously over his lips. He replayed the command, and this time the notes sounded clear. "Sir?" Lieutenant Malcolmson reined in at Jack's side. "Orders?" "We have to retire. Those bastards are trying to cut us off." Jack snapped off the instruction. "Very good." Malcolmson understood instantly. "We ride hard." Jack reined his own horse round. "If we're quick, we can hit them in the flank before they work out that we've seen what they're up to." Malcolmson said nothing, merely nodding quickly before heading back to his troop. Jack's squadron had to move fast. The large body of Persian cavalry was attempting to sweep around and cut them off from the rest of the rearguard. The Bombay Lights would have to react quickly. It would be a race between the two groups of horsemen. If the Bombay Lights lost, they would be cut down and massacred. If they won, they could hit the enemy cavalry in the flank, but only if they were quick. The ground flew past under the hooves of Jack's horse, every impact hitting the arid soil like a gunshot. Jack could feel the film of dust covering his face, stretching his skin taut and drying out his eyes and nose. The front rank was close behind him, and they brought their sabres down to the engaged position as they thundered towards the rearguard. Jack could see enough to spot the tremor in the enemy cavalry's ranks as they finally awoke to the sudden appearance of the squadron of charging horsemen they had been attempting to outflank. The confusion was immediate, the cohesion of their loose formation disappearing in a heartbeat as most of the terrified Persians immediately turned and raced away. Yet there was not enough time for them all to escape the charging Bombay Lights. Jack would have bellowed in delight if he had had the breath. His men had reacted fast and had snatched the initiative from the enemy. They were no longer the quarry, but the hunter. His head whipped back and forth as he tried to judge time and distance. Then he raked back his spurs and led his men into the charge. The Bombay Lights raced forward, letting their horses use their reserves of strength in a final muscle-stretching burst of speed. They smashed into the Persian cavalry's ranks, their greater momentum driving them into the enemy horsemen with a sickening thump. Jack was at the forefront of the melee. He slashed his tulwar at a fast-moving figure to his left. The blade sighed through the air, and he howled in disappointment, the speed of his horse taking him past the enemy before the blow could land. He wrenched at the reins, slowing his mount and searching out another target. A trooper from the Bombay Lights rushed past him, riding across his line. Jack could do nothing but watch in grim approval as the man spurred his horse hard, driving it at a Persian horseman slow to react to the counterattack. The trooper shouted once, a yell of frustration released, before he chopped his heavy sabre down onto the enemy's head, bludgeoning him to the ground with a single vicious blow. Jack urged his horse on, looking for danger, though his desire to fight was overridden by the more urgent need to understand the chaotic melee. His men had broken the enemy ranks, the bulk of those left in the saddle in full flight to the rear. A dozen scraps were still going on, his troopers trading blows with the Persian riders who had been unable to escape the charge. It would soon be time to reform. The Wild dashed to their rear, having left the Bombay Lights' own ranks badly disordered. Jack opened his mouth, preparing to issue the orders that would bring those men not engaged with the enemy back under control. The words died on his lips. Not all the enemy cavalry were in flight. The men on the flank furthest from the Bombay Lights' charge had ridden on, their officers driving them past the British cavalry and towards the rearguard. Jack saw the danger. Any notion of success was lost. He twisted, desperately looking for the trumpeter, yet knowing it was already too late. There was no sign of the boy. The melee with the Persian cavalry had separated him from his commander. Jack cursed and forced his horse around, turning it to face the sudden threat to the British rear. He was not alone in spotting the danger. A small group of British officers were spurring hard as they saw the Persian horsemen racing towards the 4th Rifles' undefended flank. They would be horribly outnumbered, but they rode at the attacking cavalry nonetheless, throwing themselves into their path in a courageous attempt to save the riflemen, who were still unaware of the danger, their thin defensive line dreadfully vulnerable to the marauding Persians. Jack's heels worked vigorously to force his exhausted mount back into the gallop. He had no choice but to risk everything on a madcap dash back across the plain. If he was too late, the British officers would die, and the Persian cavalry would have a clear path to the rearguard's undefended flank. Chapter 32. There was no time for the niceties of regular orders. Jack's men swirled around him, some still fighting the enemy horsemen, others looking for their mates and their officers, ready for the next set of instructions. Their ordered ranks were broken, the violent contact with the Persian cavalry shattering the neat lines in which they had charged. "Follow me!" Jack screamed the command. It was one more suited to the chaos of an infantry assault than to the ordered world of the cavalry, but he did not have time to gather an organized group. He did not wait to see if anyone understood. He simply rammed his spurs into his horse's flanks, cruel in his mastery, the need for speed doing away with any notion of gentility. The willing horse responded well, and Jack raced past his disordered troopers, catching fleeting glimpses of astonished faces as their new commander powered to the rear, exhorting his men to follow. He could see at least 24 enemy horsemen swarming around the handful of red-coated officers. Even from a distance he could make out the flash of a sabre as the heavily outnumbered officers fought desperately to stop the enemy attack. With such odds, the result was a foregone conclusion. Even as Jack raced towards them, he saw one of the red-coated figures topple from the saddle. The man hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his sword from his grasp. The fallen rider's horse twisted on the spot, its dark pelt matted with blood from a dozen wounds. It bravely lifted its head, trying to obey the training that was buried deep in its instincts, but the valiant animal was too badly wounded, and its legs buckled beneath it. It screamed as it fell, an animal shriek of mortal agony, then toppled on its master, crushing the man to the ground. Jack watched in horror as the closest Persians slashed at the fallen rider, trying to finish him off, whilst their fellows traded blows with the other red-coated officers still in the saddle. Swords thrust downwards, but the body of the dying horse frustrated them, its flesh absorbing the vicious attacks meant for its master. Jack screamed as his mount closed the last of the distance. He caught a glimpse of one of the Persian cavalrymen turning in surprise as he became aware of the lone rider charging towards them. He slashed his sword from right to left, slicing the sharpened edge across the closest face. He felt the blade catch as it drove through flesh, the bright spray of blood telling him his aim had been true. He tugged on the reins, turning his horse's head round, avoiding the body that tumbled from the saddle, his first victim falling without a sound. He saw a second rider come into range, and he drove his sword forward, thrusting the tip into the man's stomach. The blade slid into the Persian's guts, and Jax twisted it, releasing the tulwar from the inevitable suction, tugging it free as he rode past. He thought of nothing as he fought. He saw not other men, but merely targets for his sword. The first attacks had slowed his horse, and now he spurred it on, making it lurch into motion once again. It bounded forward, pushing past enemy riders, its forelegs scrabbling as they fought for purchase on the friable ground. He felt a tug on his uniform and glanced down to see the tip of a lance score through the side of his jacket, before it was ripped free by the sudden movement of his horse. He felt the madness build. He let his horse run, rushing past the body of the fallen British officer, narrowly missing the hooves of the man's horse, which thrashed in pitiful agony as the animal writhed in its death throes. He roared as he attacked a crowd of Persian cavalrymen surrounding one of the officers. He flashed past the mob, slashing his tulwar into one man's side and only just missing a second as he backhanded the blade. He turned fast, riding back at the enemy, the anger driving out the last of his control. He could hear his own war cry, but it sounded as if it came from far away. He crashed into the melee, his bloodied sword whispering through the air as he battered it at the closest enemy. His arm jarred as his target blocked the blow with a fast parry. He bludgeoned the sword forward again, hacking at the man who had defied him, avoiding the Persian's own desperate lunge before driving the blade into the man's breast. His opponent fell with a scream, his hands clawing at the steel, his face twisted into an awful grimace of horror as he realized his death was upon him. The surviving Persian horsemen turned to escape. Jack's lone attack had been fast and brutally effective. 4 of their number had been slain in minutes, and the rest had no stomach for the fight now that their easy victory had been snatched away by a single blue-coated hussar. They threw their mounts round, giving the animals their heads as they tried to flee. The slowest to turn howled in frustration as his tired horse staggered, its balance thrown by the desperate manoeuvre. Jack was on him in a flash. It took barely a heartbeat for him to catch the Persian and bury his sword in his spine. The man reared in the saddle, his body arching against the sudden agony, his hand flapping at the tulwar embedded in his back. Jack pulled the blade away, and the man fell, his horse galloping free. Jack let the broken enemy go. He felt the madness of the desperate melee begin to slip away, rational thought once again taking control of his mind. He rammed his bloody tulwar back into its leather scabbard with a grimace. His right hand cramped and sore from having held the weapon so tightly as he fought. Only then did he turn and face the officers he had saved. He recognized one man at once and called across in greeting, "Captain Hunter!" Hunter looked at him without any sign of recognition. Jack's face was flecked with blood flung from his tulwar. He looked like a grotesque spectre that had escaped from a charnel house. "Fenris!" The name emerged from the shocked captain's mouth as he belatedly recognized the bloodied rider who had come to his aid. "Help me! It's the general!" He immediately slipped from his saddle and raced to the fallen officer. Jack heard the panic in the aide's voice. He jumped down and ran to help Hunter, who was doing his best to drag the general from underneath his fallen steed. Jack thrust his shoulder against the dead animal's flank, ignoring the slick sheen of blood that had covered its hide. He shoved with all his strength and managed to create enough of a gap for Hunter to haul Outram free. "Is he alive?" he asked as Hunter leant forward and laid his cheek against the general's nose. Hunter nodded quickly, before bending down and lifting Outram into a sitting position. Jack squatted down. He looked into the general's eyes and saw them open. "Sir, you're safe," he spoke reassuringly. Outram's eyes failed to focus. He had been knocked insensible by the fall. His head lolled forward and Hunter was forced to cradle him like a mother holding her newborn child for the first time. "I'll get help." Jack leapt to his feet and turned, looking for his horse. Like all well-trained cavalry mounts, it had stayed in place when he had left the saddle, and now he vaulted onto its back. As he mounted, the first of his troopers arrived at the scene. He saw the look of approval on their dark faces as they rode around him, their horses picking carefully over the bloody remains of the men he had killed. "Dekho, Sahib." The closest rider, A Cote Daffodar nodded with satisfaction at the slaughter he found scattered around his new officer. The man's drawn sabre was smeared with blood, his white uniform belts bespattered all over. "You gave those bastards a job for killing Malatsai Boador, and no mistake." The other troopers roared their approval. They raised their bloodied sabres, brandishing them to the sky, and cheered their new commander, celebrating his exploits. Jack felt his heart constrict as he listened to their loud approval. It meant more than any medal. It was a vibrant recognition of his ability to lead men in battle, and he had never known such pride. He turned to the Cote Daffodar and began issuing the orders that would bring the command to order, before sending Cornet Spens on his way to summon a litter for Outram. Daylight was beginning to creep into the sky. The long night was coming to an end. The new day was just beginning. Chapter 33. The thin morning light crept across the British ranks. The redcoats looked at one another and shared grim, thin-lipped smiles at their deliverance. The night had passed with infinite cruelty, the men forced to stand staring out into the darkness for hours, waiting for a sudden attack or the dreadful explosion of a well-directed enemy round-shot. Their nerves had been stretched thin. Thanks to the efforts of the rearguard, the enemy had been unable to reach the main ranks of the column whilst they were still dangerously exposed in a marching formation. The cavalry and the 4th Rifles had remained steady, no matter what the enemy threw at them, and they had bought enough time for the unwieldy battalions to form the defensive formation that had seen them safe through the night. Thus far they had been fortunate. The Persian gunners could have caused much destruction, the tightly packed formation the perfect target for artillery. The redcoats had been saved by the darkness, the black of night denying the enemy the chance to see what they were firing at. Barely a handful of rounds had hit the expeditionary force, but as the early morning light pushed back the gloom, the 4 guns deployed against the British were finally able to see the huge target ahead of them. Lieutenant Knightley stood in his allotted station behind the line of redcoats, doing his best to look calm and unconcerned now that his men could see his face once more. His captain was on the right flank of the company, with the senior lieutenant on the left, leaving Knightley alone with his covering sergeant to prowl behind the line. His main task was to keep the ranks tight, making sure that the files closed together if the company took casualties. The need to keep the line steady and unbroken was paramount. He had drawn his sword when the men had been ordered to fix bayonets. It had been a long time ago, and he now felt rather foolish walking around with the naked steel in his hand. He had yet to even catch a glimpse of the Persian attackers. Even as the sun crept reluctantly into the sky, it was hard to see anything beyond the ranks of tall redcoats to his front. He was beginning to believe he would go through the whole battle without once casting his eyes over the enemy. The Persian cannon fired again. Knightley looked up and saw the round shot searing through the grey morning sky. He watched, transfixed, as they raced towards the British ranks, smashing into the ground to the side of the 64th with appalling violence, gouging thick crevices in the soil before bouncing back into the air and careering forward. He shivered as he realised the morning light would let the enemy gunners aim with greater precision. He looked up and saw Lieutenant Greentree leave his allotted station on the left of the line. The senior lieutenant flashed Knightley a friendly smile as he made his way over to talk to Captain Mackler, the company commander. For a moment, Knightley considered joining the 2 officers, but the long night had worn him out and he couldn't find the energy to move. Instead, he finally decided to sheathe his sword, hoping he wouldn't be bawled out for doing so before the battalion had been ordered to unfix their bayonets. He barely registered the boom as the Persian guns fired again. His eyes felt as if they'd been filled with grit, and now that he had both hands free, he balled them into fists and rubbed them, savouring the sensation of scrubbing them clear. He opened his eyes just in time to see the round shot as it hurtled down, moving at a terrific rate before smashing into the right-hand file of his stationary company. The red, hot shot zipped into the tight files, sending a grotesque shower of blood and bone into the air and knocking men down like skittles before it sped away, its dreadful momentum barely altered by the vicious contact. Knightley felt the gorge rise in his throat as he saw the tumbled heap of men writhing on the ground. He ran forward, his body lurching into motion by itself, and reached the gory spectacle as the first victims were being dragged backwards, their shattered bodies belching so much blood that it had stained the pale, sandy soil black. Captain Mackler, Lieutenant Greentree, and 4 other redcoats had been hit, the single round shot working a dreadful destruction on the company. 6 men snatched from the fight in no more than a single heartbeat. Knightley shook his head to clear the gruesome sight from his eyes. He turned away from the horror and met the uncompromising stare of the company's colour sergeant, who had arrived to sort out the bloody mess. "Mr. Knightley, you're in charge now, sir." The words cut Knightley's soul like a knife. It had taken 1 round shot to thrust him into command of a company of redcoats, just fewer than 100 souls now his responsibility, and his alone. "Form line!" The regimental sergeant major bellowed the order. Knightley forced away the tears that had sprung unbidden to his eyes. There was no time for self-pity. He stood back and watched as the battalion musicians came forward and removed the casualties from the line of march. All the victims of the enemy round shot were alive, despite appalling wounds to their flesh. Greentree had lost a foot, and Knightley had to tear his eyes away from the gory stump that pulsed blood with every beat of the lieutenant's heart. "Come along now, sir." The colour sergeant reached forward and placed a surprisingly gentle hand on Knightley's shoulder, steering him away from the carnage. Behind them, the battalion drummers were already beating out the pace of the manoeuvre. The first light of day signalled an end to the long, nerve-shredding night. It was time to reform, to bring the redcoats out of the defensive square and into an attacking formation so they could take the fight to the enemy. Knightley trotted forward, obedient to his sergeant's instructions. "On the right, if you please, sir." He blushed and altered his route. He had been heading to his regular station behind the line, but now that he was in charge, he would have to take Captain Mackler's place on the right. The position of command was now his. "Form line!" The redcoats responded to the order with a will. They shook away the effects of having been under fire for so long, their heads lifting now they could finally see their surroundings. As they manoeuvred, the enemy artillery fire finally stopped. It was time for both sides to reform, the 2 armies bracing themselves for the real battle that had yet to begin. With staff officers racing around the manoeuvring troops, the redcoats and their native infantry formed into 2 long lines facing back the way they had come. In the front rank, the 4th Bombay Rifles took the left flank, with the 2nd European Light Infantry, the 26th Native Infantry, and the 78th Highlanders stretching away to their right. Behind them, in the second line, the Bullock Battalion marched on the left, with the 20th Native Infantry on their right and the 64th on the far flank. The early morning air resounded to the call of the bugles and the rhythm of the drum as the British Expeditionary Force came to life. Officers galloped between the battalions, ferrying orders from the senior officers and collecting reports from the battalion commanders. The beautiful regimental colours were unfurled, and the gaudy silk squares billowed in the stiff breeze that flowed across the plain. "Battalion! Battalion! Load!" The huge voice of the 64th's regimental sergeant major bellowed out. To his command, the battalion began the process of loading their Enfield rifles. The weapons were new, the battalion only having been issued with them in the weeks before their hurried departure to join the campaign. The native infantry battalions were still armed with smooth-bore percussion-capped muskets, weapons that were little changed since the days of Wellington and Waterloo. There had been rumours circulating through the division that the native soldiers had concerns about accepting the new weapons. The Enfield rifles came with a cartridge that was greased to allow it to glide over the rifling in the gun's barrel, the twisted grooves that spun the bullet and made it so much more accurate than the outdated smooth-bore muskets. It was said that the cartridges were waxed in pig fat, something that was totally abhorrent to both the high-caste Hindus and the Muslims who made up the bulk of the native infantry's ranks. Yet the concerns had been pushed to one side in the rush to embark on the campaign, and for now the native infantry would fight with their trusted, if less effective, muskets. The dispute over the cartridges would have to wait. "Battalion! Prepare to advance!" The words dispelled any last doubts. It was the final command they would be given before the order to attack. The battalion fell silent, and the men stood with their weapons ready for the fight. It was the time to wrestle with the fear that was stirring in the guts, the presence of death haunting many. This was the moment for silent prayer, for the men to seek forgiveness or to beg for protection in the battle that was now inevitable. All along the line the redcoats fidgeted with their equipment, going through the superstitious rituals that they believed would keep them safe in the fight. Each man was surrounded by thousands of fellow soldiers, yet each man was alone. The sudden strident call of the bugle cut through every man's thoughts. The drummer boys rattled their sticks against the taut skins of their instruments, summoning the men to action. "Battalion! Battalion will advance! Advance!" As one, the long lines strode forward. The men forced away their fears. The brilliantly hued silks of the battalion colours stirred in the freshening breeze, so that the huge squares spread to their fullest extent, the pride of the regiments on display. To the beat of the drums, the redcoats marched to take the fight to the enemy. They advanced as only the British advanced, the ranks stoic and steady. There was no pomp, no cheers or wild yells. The line walked forward in silence, the grave, stony faces of the redcoats betraying none of the emotion that seared through their veins. No matter how heavy the fire, no matter how many men were struck from the ranks, they would march on, ignoring their fallen comrades, the line moving forward with resolute purpose, unrelenting and unstoppable. The enemy had belatedly chosen to give battle. The British redcoats would not shirk from the fight.